He threw the money at her feet, not handed, threw. 20 crumpled dollars landed in the dirt in front of everyone. The blacksmith, the feed store owner, 3 women by the dry goods counter, and Bramwell Sutter crossed his thick arms and smiled like a man who had already won. "Pick it up, girl," he said. "Before the wind takes it and you've got nothing at all." Maren Bellrose stood completely still. The coat on her back was her dead father's, patched at both elbows too big across the shoulders. Her travel bag weighed almost nothing because there was almost nothing in it. She had walked 11 miles to reach this town. Her feet were bleeding inside her boots, and every single person in that general store was watching to see if she would bend down and take it. If you were standing in her shoes right now, broke, grieving, a stranger in a town that had already decided what you were worth, what would you do? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. These are the kinds of tales we live for, stories about ordinary people who carried impossible weight and refused to break. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It truly helps more than you know. Now let's go back to the beginning. Maren Bellrose was 20 years old when her father died, and she inherited a hole in the ground. That was how the land office clerk put it, not in those exact words, but close enough. He's just across the counter without making eye contact, the way people do when they're handing you something they already know is useless. Blackfinch Claim, a mining parcel in the Cinderwash Territory, northeastern Nevada. 50 feet of tunnel bored into solid granite, no recorded silver yield, no active operation. Ephraim Bellrose had held that claim for 11 years. 11 years of digging, of sending letters home that always started with "next season," and "I'm getting close." And then one morning, he simply did not wake up, and that was the entire sum of what he left behind. The clerk had given Maren a look she recognized because she had been receiving variations of it her entire life. It was the look people gave a heavy girl who took up more space than they thought she deserved. Quick assessment, top to bottom, the extra weight she carried, the worn dress, the oversized coat, and then a small internal conclusion reached before she had spoken a single word. Not cruel, exactly. Worse than cruel. Indifferent. "You'll want to sell," he told her. "Not a question." "I'll want to see it first," she said. He blinked, as if the concept required translation. The journey to Cinderwash took 2 days by stage and then another half day on foot because the last driver refused to take his horses up a road he called barely a suggestion. Maren walked those 11 miles in boots that had started the trip too tight and ended it rubbing her heels raw. The weight she carried, her own body, the travel bag, the coat made every uphill stretch a negotiation between her lungs and her legs. She stopped 4 times. She did not stop a 5th time, even when she wanted to. Cinderwash was dying, and it looked the part. It had been a proper settlement once, probably. You could see the ambition in the original buildings, a hotel that might have held 30 rooms, a wide main street laid out with the intention of growing into something. The silver had turned out thinner than the maps promised, and the mines that had actually produced anything were mostly played out now, and what remained was a town of about 300 people who stayed, because leaving required energy that sustained disappointment had quietly drained from them. She noticed how people looked at her when she came down the main street. There was the wait thing, always the wait thing eyes that went to her body before her face. A half-second pause before anyone decided whether to bother addressing her directly. And then there was the Bellrose thing. When she asked the woman at the boarding house for a room, the woman asked her last name, and when Maren said it, something shifted in the woman's expression. Not hostility exactly, pity, which felt worse. "Ephraim's girl," the woman said softly. "Daughter, yes." The woman nodded and took her money and didn't say anything else. But the look stayed, and Maren understood from it that her father's failure had preceded her the same way. Her size had a fact about her, that people felt they understood before she could complicate it with her actual self. She asked around about Blackfinch Claim. The answers were all variations of the same thing, delivered with different levels of sympathy. Worthless, played out from the start. Ephraim Bellrose had been a dreamer, people said, not unkindly, but not kindly either the way you describe, a man who wasted his potential on something foolish and paid for it accordingly. He had dug for 11 years, and produced nothing and died with nothing. And the hole in the mountain was the sum of his life's work. Sell it, the blacksmith told her before she had asked his opinion. Get what you can for it, the woman at the dry goods store said, before Maren had said what she intended to do. It was Bramwell Sutter who made her an offer the next morning. He arrived at the boarding house early, which was deliberate, early enough that she would not have eaten breakfast, not yet oriented in the way that a good night's rest and a hot meal can make a person feel more certain about things. He was a large man in his mid-50s, not fat in the way the world treated fat, but broad and deliberate, the kind of man who had learned long ago that his physical presence was a tool he could use. He wore good boots. His coat fit him correctly. Everything about him communicated that he was a man who was accustomed to the space he occupied being considered reasonable. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her in the boarding house dining room without asking if she minded. Bramwell Sutter, he said, and named himself the way people do when they expect the name to do work, when they expect to see recognition, and then a recalibration of how you're sitting. Maren didn't recalibrate. I know who you are. He had, it turned out, the largest private landholding in the Cinder Wash Valley. 3 ranches, significant grazing rights, and the thing that mattered most, the deepest well in the territory, which, in a region where the summer months could go brutal, meant he had the kind of leverage that didn't need to announce itself. He offered her $20 for the claim. She looked at him. The claim is worth more than that. The claim is worth a mountain of nothing. He said it pleasantly, the way you correct a child who has made an innocent error. Your father's tunnel goes 50 feet and hits granite. The survey was done twice. There's no silver. There was never silver. He paused. Let that settle. I'm offering you $20 out of courtesy, miss. I want you to know that. Courtesy, she repeated. You're young. You've come a long way. I'd hate to see you make a difficult situation worse by misunderstanding your position. He was telling her she had no position. He was telling her that the hole in the mountain was worth less than what he'd spent on breakfast, and he was offering her the $20 not because it was fair, but because he wanted her gone quickly and cheaply. The math was simple, and he expected her to do it. Maren looked at the $20 on the table. No, she said. Sutter paused. The pleasantness didn't leave his face exactly, but it rearranged itself into something more careful. I'd take some time to think. I've thought, she said. The answer is no. He picked up the money and left. And the look he gave her on the way out was not fury, which she might have respected. It was the same look the land office clerk had given her, the same look the woman at the boarding house had given her when she said her last name. Patient certainty that she would eventually understand her own limitations. She went to Blackfinch Claim that same afternoon. The trail up the mountain was steep and rutted, and her body made itself known on every switchback. Her thighs burned. Her lungs pulled hard for air in the higher altitude. The coat that had been her father's made her sweat in the afternoon heat, but she didn't take it off. She couldn't have explained why. It would have felt like something she wasn't ready to do. The mouth of the tunnel was smaller than she'd imagined, maybe 4 feet wide, 5 feet tall, reinforced at the entrance with timber that had grayed from years of weather. The surrounding rock face was unremarkable, no markings, no indication of anything worth the years her father had given it. There was a crude lean-to-off to one side, half collapsed, that had apparently served as a camp at some point. She stood at the entrance for a long time. She had a lantern. She had the deed. She had almost nothing else. Maren went inside. The tunnel was exactly what everyone had described, a narrow corridor, bored into the mountain. Not quite straight. The walls bearing the marks of her father's work, in the chisel pattern she could see when she held the lantern close. It smelled of old stone, and something faint she couldn't name, something cold and mineral. 50 feet in, the tunnel ended at a flat rock face. Her lantern showed nothing remarkable about it, just stone. She stood there for a while, looking at the wall her father had stopped at. 11 years. 11 years he had worked this claim, and this was what he'd gotten to. Dead end. She touched the rock. It was cold under her fingers, colder than the surrounding walls, which she noted without knowing what to make of it yet. She pressed her ear against it, feeling somewhat foolish, and heard nothing except the distant compression of the mountain's own silence. She went back outside and sat down in the dirt and tried to organize her thoughts. It was while she was sitting there that the old woman appeared. She came along the ridge trail from the eastern side of the mountain, moving with the particular economy of someone who knew exactly where to put their feet and didn't waste motion. She was Paiute, Maren would learn later, and she had lived in this valley for decades, long enough that the town of Cinderwash had grown up around her like a plant growing around an obstacle. Her name was Nessa Grey Willow, and she was perhaps 70, perhaps older. Her face was deeply lined, and her eyes were the kind of dark that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. She stopped when she saw Maren and looked at her without apparent surprise, as though she had expected to find a young woman sitting in the dirt outside an abandoned mine. "You're Ephraim's daughter," Nessa said. "How did you know?" Same, she said it simply. He wore it every day, cold or not. Maren pulled the coat tighter without meaning to. "You knew my father." "Some." Nessa came and sat down nearby, not beside her, but close enough to talk. She studied Maren's face the way older people sometimes do, looking for things rather than at things. "They tell you it was worthless," she said. "It was not a question. Everyone I've spoken to." Nessa was quiet for a moment. A hawk turned in slow circles above the ridge, and they both watched it without saying anything. "Your father," Nessa finally said, "he dug for silver the first few years. Same as anyone." She paused. Then he stopped listening for silver. Maren waited. "He started listening to the silence," Nessa said. "I don't know what that means." "No." Nessa stood, and the ease with which she rose, no hesitation, no complaining joints, was its own kind of statement. "You will." She walked back along the ridge trail and didn't look back. Maren sat there as the light began to flatten into early evening, turning those 5 words over, listening to the silence. Her father, 11 years. A wall at the end of a tunnel. A cold draft she hadn't mentioned to anyone, because she hadn't quite registered it consciously until this moment. Cold draft. From a wall that dead-ended against solid rock. She got up and went back into the tunnel with her lantern, and this time she moved slowly, held the lantern low, paid attention to what her body was feeling rather than what her eyes were seeing. 20 feet in. 30. 40. There. At the back wall, barely perceptible, a thread of air moved against the back of her hand. So slight she might have dismissed it as the movement of her own breath. But she held perfectly still, and it continued cool and steady and coming from somewhere beyond a wall that should not have had anywhere to come from. Maren pressed her palm flat against the wall. Cold stone. Colder than what surrounded it. She lifted the lantern and looked, really looked, at the surface, not for what it was presenting, but for what it might be concealing. And then she saw it. The mortar lines. Not natural fractures in the rock. Deliberate seams. Someone had fitted stones together and disguised the joins with granite dust and whatever else had been available, and done it well enough that it passed for solid wall in any light, but a lantern held 6 inches from the surface. This was not where her father had stopped digging. This was where her father had built something. The realization moved through her slowly. The way cold water moves you understand it, before you fully feel it. Her father had not given up. He had not hit granite and conceded defeat. He had bored through this mountain and found something on the other side, and then he had sealed it and walked back to town, and let everyone believe he had failed. He had chosen to look like a failure. Why? She backed out of the tunnel and sat in the cold mountain air and looked at the valley below, where the lights of Cinderwash were just beginning to appear as the sky darkened. Down there, Bramwell Sutcher was eating his dinner in a house that probably had more rooms than it needed, confident that by the end of the week, the Bellrose girl would take whatever he offered and be gone. Maren thought about her father wearing this coat every day for 11 years. She thought about a thread of air coming from a wall that had no business having air behind it. She thought about an old woman who had known Maren Bellrose and chosen to say exactly 4 words about what he'd found out here. Listening to the silence, whatever was behind that wall, whatever her father had worked 11s to reared reach and then sealed away from the world, she was going to find it. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow boarding house bed and thought about the mortar lines and the cold draft and the way the lantern had shown her something that everyone else, every prospector, every surveyor who had dismissed this claim had apparently never bothered to look for, or had looked and hadn't seen, or had seen and said nothing. By morning, she had made a decision. She gathered her things, paid the boarding house woman for 2 more nights, and bought supplies at the dry goods store enough to camp for several days, maybe a week. The woman behind the counter watched her without comment, though her eyes did what eyes always did, the body first, then the face, then whatever conclusion lived between those two observations. "You're staying," the woman said. "For now." She carried the supplies up the mountain herself. It took 2 trips because she couldn't manage it all in one, and the trail was steep, and by the time she'd made the second trip her legs were shaking, and she was sweating through the back of the coat she still wouldn't remove. She set up camp in the ruins of her father's old lean-to, reinforcing what remained of it with spare timber she found stacked along the mine entrance. Her father had stacked it there. He had planned to come back. She thought about that while she worked, and it sat oddly in her chest, not quite grief, something more complicated than grief, something that felt like the beginning of understanding. That evening, she built a small fire and ate hardtack and salted pork and looked out at the valley below. The sun went behind the western peaks, and the temperature dropped fast, the way it does in high desert country. She pulled the coat tighter. Tomorrow, she was going to start breaking through that wall. She had no way of knowing what it would cost her. She had no way of knowing that the town below was about to come to her, desperate and thirsty and ready. Finally, to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Maren Bellrose and the hole he had dug in the side of a mountain. She knew only what she had: a lantern, a pickaxe, a pair of already ruined hands, and the absolute certainty that her father had not spent 11 years of his life on nothing. The mountain was cold. The fire was small. Maren Bellrose sat in the dark and refused to be afraid of it. She started with her bare hands. Not because she intended to, she had the pickaxe. She had the small hand chisel she'd found, wrapped in oilcloth in her father's supply stack, but because the first thing she did when she got back into that tunnel the next morning was press both palms flat against the false wall and just stand there for a while, feeling the cold air push against her skin through the invisible seams in the mortar. It was real. It wasn't something she had imagined in bad light and told herself a story about. There was something at the other side. She picked up the chisel and tapped it lightly against one of the mortar lines, not to break it yet, just to hear the sound. The tap echoed differently than it would against solid granite, a fraction of a second longer, a tiny hollow resonance underneath the stone's surface voice. If you weren't listening for it, you wouldn't hear it. If you were listening the way her father apparently had learned to listen, it was unmistakable. "What did you find?" she asked the wall. She wasn't expecting an answer. She knew that. But talking out loud in the tunnel made the space feel less like a grave and more like a room, and she needed that. So she kept doing it. She started at the lower left corner of the false wall, where one of the mortar lines was thickest. The chisel bit into it with the first real strike of the hammer. The mortar was old, nearly a decade old at minimum, and the desert dryness had done what desert dryness does to binding materials over time. It crumbled at the edges before the center gave. She worked carefully, more carefully than she wanted to, because the tunnel was narrow and the ceiling was low, and a poorly placed strike could bring down something she didn't want brought down. This was the first day, the first 4 hours. She pulled out a stone roughly the size of her fist from the lower corner, and the thread of cold air that had been moving through the seams suddenly intensified into something she could feel against her face. A breath from somewhere deep and dark and large. She sat back on her heels and stared at the hole she had made. It was too small to see through, too small even to get useful light through with the lantern. But the air that came out of it now was distinctly different from the tunnel air, colder. Yes, but also different in a way she struggled to name. Cleaner, maybe, like air that had never been breathed. Plugged the hole with her jacket sleeve temporarily and went outside to eat and rest her arms, which were already trembling from the unfamiliar work. The altitude made everything harder. Her body, which had always required more from her just to move through the world, was operating at a deficit she hadn't fully calculated when she'd decided to do this. Her shoulder joints ached from the angle she'd been working at. Her back was informing her, in considerable detail, about the strain she'd put on it. She ate cold food and didn't enjoy it and went back in. She worked until the light outside failed, which was how she measured time inside the tunnel, not by any clock, but by the quality of the pale rectangle of sky visible at the tunnel's entrance. When that rectangle went orange, she stopped. When it went purple, she came out. When it went black, she was already in her bedroll in the lean-to, too exhausted to think much about anything. This was her routine for 3 days. 3 days of chiseling and hammering and pulling old stone out of a wall that had been put there by a man she had never been able to fully understand while he was alive. 3 days of accumulating bruised knuckles and a left palm blister that broke on the second afternoon and wept, in a way she had to wrap cloth around to keep working. 3 days of dust in her lungs and aching shoulders and eating meals she barely tasted because her mind stayed in the tunnel even when her body came out. On the third evening, she crawled out of the tunnel and found Nessa Grey Willow sitting in the cold fire ring as though she had been there for some time. "You're still at it," Nessa said. "I am." Maren sat down across from her and started working the cloth wrap off her left hand. The blister underneath looked angry. She had stopped being surprised by the old woman's appearances. Nessa moved through this mountain the way water moves, finding paths that weren't obvious, arriving where she needed to be. Nessa looked at the hand without expression. "How much have you taken out?" "Maybe a third of it, maybe less." Maren flexed her fingers carefully, testing. Solid work he did. The mortar is it wasn't done in a hurry. He took his time fitting the stones. He was a careful man, Nessa said, about the things that mattered to him. Maren looked at her. "You said he stopped listening for silver. What was he looking for instead?" Nessa didn't answer immediately. She had this way of holding silence that wasn't evasion. It was more like she was deciding how much of a thing to give you at one time, measuring out information the way you'd measure out something potent. Too much at once was its own kind of problem. "He came to me 4 years ago," Nessa said. "In the spring, he had been in that tunnel for weeks, and he was different. Not excited. Not the way a man is when he's found silver." She paused. "Quiet. The way a man is when he has found something that frightens him a little." "What did he tell you?" "He didn't. Not directly." She picked up a small stone from the ground and turned it in her fingers. "He asked me about water, about how deep the aquifers ran under this range, about whether the old people who had lived before the miners had ever spoken of underground water." The word landed in Maren's chest before she fully processed why. "Water." "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him what I knew. There were stories. Very old stories about water beneath the eastern mountains, water that didn't come from snowmelt, water that had been there longer than memory." Nessa set the stone down. "He listened to everything I said, and then he thanked me and walked back up the mountain, and I didn't see him again for 6 months." Maren stared at the dark tunnel entrance. Water, the cold air, the air that smelled like nothing had ever breathed it. The windows were the temperature differential that she had registered but hadn't named because she'd been focused on the fact of the wall rather than what the wall was keeping contained. Cold air came from cold places, and in a desert range, in a sealed cavern beneath a mountain, that kind of cold came from one thing. "He found water," she said. Not a question. Nessa looked at her steadily. "I don't know what he found, he never told me, but I know what he was looking for." She stood the same effortless rising that Maren had noticed the first time. "And I know that whatever it was, he's decided it needed protecting more than it needed discovering." She left the way she always left, the ridge trail, disappearing into the dark with the ease of someone who had spent so much time on this mountain that the mountain had stopped being an obstacle and become simply a place she lived. Maren sat alone with the fire she finally lit and the thought she couldn't stop turning over. Her father had found water, in a territory where the nearest reliable water source was miles away, in a settlement where the deepest private well was owned by Bramwell Sutter and accessed at Bramwell Sutter's discretion and Bramwell Sutter's price, in a high desert valley where a bad drought, the kind that came every 10 or 15 years, the kind that came without warning and stayed as long as it pleased, could turn a struggling settlement into a ghost town inside of a single summer. Her father had found water and sealed it away. Not because he didn't know its value, because he knew it too well. She sat with that for a long time. The fire popped and shrank, and she fed it another piece of the dry wood her father had stacked and looked up at the stars, which at this altitude were so dense they looked like they were competing for space. Maren Bellrose, the failed dreamer, the stubborn fool who had buried himself in a mountain for 11 years while his wife died and his daughter grew up without him, and the town laughed about him at the saloon and pitied him the rest of the time. The man who had left behind nothing but a coat with patches on the elbows and a hole in the ground. He had found the most valuable thing in the territory, and he had chosen to look like a failure rather than let that thing fall into the wrong hands. She didn't know yet whether to be furious with him or awed by him. She thought it might be both for a long time. The fourth day was worse than the first three combined. She had been working with the energy of early purpose, the kind of focused drive that carries you through the initial stage of any hard thing before the accumulated damage catches up. On day 4, the accumulated damage caught up. Her hands had stiffened overnight in the cold, and she had to soak them in the small amount of water she had warmed over the morning fire just to get them workable. Most of its windows were dark. Her shoulders had passed the complaining stage and gone into something quieter and more consistent, a deep muscular fatigue that she felt with every upward swing of the pickaxe. And the work itself had gotten harder. The lower portion of the false wall, the part she'd been working through, had been built with older, crumbling mortar. But as she worked upward and toward the center, the construction quality changed. Stones were fitted more precisely. The mortar was thicker and had cured harder. This was the heart of what her father had built, and he had built it to last. She had to switch to shorter strokes. The pickaxe was too much tool for the precision the work required. Now she needed the chisel and hammer, and she needed patience she wasn't entirely sure she had left. She worked for 2 hours and made for progress she could have covered with her hand. Took a break she didn't want to take because her left arm had started shaking involuntarily, which was her body's way of informing her that she had ignored several of its previous requests. Came back in, worked for another hour. She was on her knees in the tunnel, working at a particularly stubborn section of mortar between 2 stones near the center of the wall, when her chisel found a different kind of resistance. Not stone, not hardened mortar. She pulled the chisel back and brought the lantern close and looked. Something was embedded in the mortar. She worked around it carefully, more carefully than she'd worked at anything yet, using the tip of the chisel like a brush rather than a tool, clearing away the crumbled mortar from around whatever was there. Took longer than it should have, because her hands were shaking slightly, and the light wasn't good, and she was trying not to let herself believe what she was beginning to suspect she was looking at. It was a silver locket, small and oval, on a length of chain that had oxidized almost black. The locket itself was tarnished but intact, deliberately pressed into the mortar while it was still wet, and then allowed to become part of the wall. She got it free without breaking the chain, which felt like a small victory in a day that had not offered many. She sat back against the tunnel wall and held it up to the lantern. She knew this locket. She was 4 years old when her mother died too young for reliable memory, but old enough for certain objects to have lodged themselves in her mind the way significant things do in young children, through a combination of visual repetition and emotional weight. She had seen this locket in a small box among her mother's few possessions, and she had asked about it once, and her father had taken it out carefully and held it for a moment, and then put it back and said it had belonged to her mother's mother. Then he had left for Nevada, and she had not seen the locket since, and she had assumed he had taken it because he missed her mother and needed something to hold when the mountain was cold, and the work wasn't going well, and the distance between a man and everything he'd left behind felt infinite. She opened it. Inside was a small photograph, the kind that fit a locket's oval, taken formally. The way portraits were taken in those years, a woman's of it sitting very still and looking directly at the camera with an expression that was composed but not cold. Maren had no photographs of her mother. She had been told her whole life that there were none. There was one. Her father had carried it into a mountain and built it into a wall. She sat in the tunnel for a while and didn't try to stop the tears, which would have been pointless because they came anyway. The kind of tears that aren't really about sadness, but about something closer to recognition, finally ceasing a thing that had been there all along, just in a form you didn't know to look for. Her father had put the locket in the wall, not to hide it. He had put it where only someone who broke through would find it. He was leaving something for whoever came after, and there was only one person who was ever going to come after him. And she was sitting in the tunnel floor with mortar dust on her face and her dead mother's locket in her hand. He had known she would come. The thought moved through her differently than the grief. It was something stronger than comfort and more specific than love. He had known her well enough, trusted her enough to build this into his plan. Not an accident, not a man who had run out of room for the locket and just tucked it in the wall. Deliberate. A message written in the only language available to a man who had run out of time to say things directly. Keep going. She went back to work. The 5th day she broke through. Not dramatically, there was no single stone that gave way and revealed everything at once. It was a section about 2 feet across and 3 feet high near the center of the false wall, and it came apart in stages, 1 stone at a time, until there was an opening large enough to push the lantern through and look. Couldn't see much from the angle. The lantern lit a stretch of tunnel beyond the wall. Not a wall of rock waiting on the other side, but an actual continuation of passageway, maybe 8 feet of it, and then what looked like an edge of something. The end of the floor, and then darkness below and beyond it that the lantern's reach couldn't measure. The air coming through was cold and heavy with moisture. Moisture. In a desert mountain. Her hands were shaking again, but not from fatigue this time. She spent 2 more hours enlarging the opening until it was wide enough for her to squeeze through. Wide enough for her specifically was not a guarantee. Her frame was broad, her hips were wide, and the tunnel itself had never been built to generous tolerances. She had been navigating this tunnel every day with the constant low-grade awareness that it was not built for someone her size, that every time she turned or knelt or pressed herself against a wall to work, her body was in conversation with a space that hadn't accounted for it. But the opening she made was hers to determine, and she made it the right size. She went back to camp and ate a real meal. For the first time in days she'd been eating on the move, picking at food without sitting down, rationing both the food and the attention she gave to eating it. She sat by a fire and ate slowly and let herself feel what she was feeling, which was a combination of exhausted and terrified, and something she could only describe as the particular loneliness of being the only person on Earth who knew what she knew. Nobody down in Cinder Wash had any idea what was behind that wall. They thought she was a heavy, foolish, grieving girl trying to hold on to a dead man's failed dream. They thought she'd crack in another week and take whatever Sutter offered and go home to wherever home was. Sutter himself was probably not thinking about her much at all. By now she was too small a problem to occupy a man with bigger concerns. She would solve herself eventually. Problems like Maren Bellrose always did. She put the locket around her own neck and went to sleep. Most of it she went back in. In the morning, the 8 feet of tunnel beyond the false wall was rough unfinished, in the way the earlier part of the tunnel was finished. Her father had spent years smoothing and supporting the first 50 feet of passage. This section he had bored quickly and with intention, not comfort. The ceiling was lower, and she had to move with her head down and her shoulders angled, which pulled at the muscles she'd already spent 5 days punishing. She reached the edge and stopped. The lantern wasn't enough. She understood that immediately. The space beyond the edge of the floor was enormous. She could tell that from the way the light died. Lantern light in a closed room bounces off walls and ceiling and comes back to you with information. Lantern light in a truly large space just disappears, and what you feel is the absence of it, the scale of what it failed to reach. She was looking into something that swallowed light. She went back to camp and came back with every source of illumination. She had her lantern, a second lantern she'd brought but barely used, 3 candles. She lit all of them and held them together at the edge, and leaned out carefully over what turned out to be a short drop of about 4 feet to a lower surface, and the combined light reached a little further. Water. Not a puddle, not a pool, a lake. An underground lake that extended far enough that even with every candle she had, she couldn't see where it ended. The surface was still, perfectly still, the way water is still when nothing has disturbed it in a very long time. It was dark and cold, and it reflected the light back up at her in small wavering points, like stars she was looking down at instead of up. She sat at the edge and looked at it for a long time. 11 years. 11 years her father had come up this mountain and worked this tunnel and told nobody, and come back down and eaten dinner in his camp and done it again the next day. 11 years of being called a fool, a dreamer, a man who didn't know when to quit. And what he'd been doing the entire time, what the silence had been telling him, was this. The valley below had no idea it was sitting over a lake. The valley below was owned, in every practical sense, by a man who controlled the only reliable water in the territory. Most of its windsown the Satar, with his deep well and his lock on the pump, and his pleasant, patient certainty that scarcity was a tool that could be used against people indefinitely. And underneath the mountain, those people could see from every window in Cinder Wash, was enough water to make Sutter's well irrelevant. Her father had known, and he had sealed it away. She understood, sitting at the edge of that underground lake, with all her candles burning, and her hands still wrapped in cloth, and the locket resting against her sternum, that her father's decision was not simple. It had not been a moment of clarity, a single clean moral choice. It had been a sustained act of will, repeated every single day for years, the choice not to use a thing, because using it meant losing control of it, and losing control of it meant men like Sutter would get to it and do what men like Sutter always do with things that other people need. He had decided that a future in which this water could be used well was worth more than any present in which it got used wrong. He had been waiting for someone he could trust. She put her hand in the water. It was shockingly cold, the way water is cold when it has never been touched by sunlight. Clean. She could feel that clean the way only water that has traveled slowly through stone for a very long time can be clean. She brought her cupped hand to her mouth and drank. It was the best water she had ever tasted, which she understood was not entirely objective, given everything she'd spent to get here. But it was good water, pure and cold, and with a faint mineral quality that wasn't unpleasant, like the mountain itself had contributed something to it, which of course it had. She sat there for a while longer. Then she heard it. From somewhere above her, up through the shaft of the tunnel, filtered by rock and distance but unmistakable voices. More than one. Coming up the trail toward Blackfinch Claim. She moved quickly back through the passage, through the broken wall, into the main tunnel, and came out blinking into afternoon light, to find 3 men standing at the mouth of the mine. 2 of them she didn't recognize, hired hands by the look of them, range riders who'd been told to go somewhere and gone there. The third was a man she'd seen once in Cinder Wash, a foreman who worked for Sutter's main ranch operation. Miss Bellrose, the foreman said. He wasn't being aggressive, which somehow made it worse. He had the tone of a man delivering a message that he personally had no stake in. Mr. Sutter asked me to check in on you. See if you've reconsidered his offer. Maren stood at the tunnel entrance and didn't move away from it. Tell Mr. Sutter I haven't, she said. The foreman nodded, like that was the answer he'd expected, like there was a next step after this one that had already been planned out. He's raised it, the man said. $50. He wanted you to know that. $50. He'd gone from 20 to 50 without being asked, which meant one of 2 things. Either he knew more about what was in this mountain than she'd assumed, or he had an instinct about it that his pride wouldn't let him name directly. Either way, he was paying more attention to her than she'd thought. Still no, she said. The foreman looked at her for a moment, not the way Sutter looked at her, not with that patient condescension. This man's look was something closer to curiosity. He glanced at the tunnel entrance behind her, and then back at her face, and she had the sudden clear sense that he was a man doing a job he hadn't entirely agreed to take. He won't be as patient as he's been, the foreman said quietly. I heard you, she said. Tell him I appreciate the concern. They left. She stood at the tunnel entrance and watched them go down the trail, 3 figures getting smaller against the slope until they reached the switchback that took them out of sight. Then she turned and looked at the tunnel. Behind her was a lake she couldn't tell anyone about yet. Below her was a man who had just doubled his offer without being asked. She went back inside and started planning how to shore up the broken wall, not rebuild it. She couldn't do that with what she had, but secure it, cover it, make it look like she'd been excavating rather than breaking through. She spent the rest of the afternoon arranging broken stones in front of the opening to give the impression of a collapse rather than a passage. It was not a great solution. It would not fool anyone who came in and looked carefully. But it would have to do for now, because she wasn't ready, the valley wasn't ready, and whatever was going to happen next was going to happen because she decided it would, not because Bramwell Sutter decided to send riders up a mountain. By the time she came out, the sky was the deep blue that comes just before dark, and Cinder Wash was lit up below her in scattered orange windows. She sat at the edge of the camp and looked at it. 300 people down there, maybe a few more. Families who had built something in this hard ground and stayed with it even when the silver stopped. And the options narrowed, and the options narrowed further. Children who played in the dust of a town that might not exist in 10 years if the water situation didn't change. Old people who had buried other old people in the small cemetery on the eastern edge of town and intended to be buried there themselves, which required the town to still be there when they died. And Bramwell Sutters, moving through all of it like a man who owned not just land, but the conditions of other people's survival. The locket was cool against her chest. She thought about what her father had written in his journal. She hadn't found the journal yet, but she believed it existed, the same way she believed in the water before she saw it, the same way she was increasingly believing things about a man. She had always understood as absence more than presence. He had put the locket in the wall. He had put something in this mountain for her to find. The locket was one thing, there was more. She could feel it the same way she had felt the cold air coming through the mortar seams, a certainty that wasn't based on evidence yet, but was based on knowing in the particular bone-deep way that children know the texture of their parents even when the parents are far away or gone. Her father had been a careful man, Nessa had said, about the things that mattered to him. He had been careful here. She just hadn't found all of it yet. Tomorrow she would go back down into the cavern. She would bring a rope this time, and she would find a way to the lake's edge properly, and she would for whatever else he had left behind. She banked the fire and lay down in the bedroll, still in the coat, the locket in her closed fist. Below her, the lights of Cinderwash went out, one by one, as the town went to sleep, not knowing what was underneath the mountain it lived beside, not knowing what the man they had called a fool had spent 11 years protecting, not knowing that his daughter, the overweight girl, nobody expected anything from, was sleeping on a ridge above them, with the future of their town resting in the palm of her hand. She didn't feel powerful. She felt heavy and sore and uncertain in the way that comes from knowing something enormous that you don't yet know how to use. But she held the locket tight and she didn't let go, and in the morning she would go back in, and whatever her father had left for her to find, she was going to find it. She went back in before the sun was fully up. The rope she had was 30 feet of hemp she'd bought at the dry goods store on her second supply run, telling the woman behind the counter she needed it for camp rigging without explaining further. She had also brought a tin bucket, a second length of cord, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes not from confidence but from having nothing left to be afraid of losing. The passage through the broken wall was easier the second time. Her body remembered the angle. The body remembered the angle, the way you had to drop your left shoulder and turn your hips, the exact point where the broken stone edge caught if you weren't careful. She moved through it with a lantern held ahead of her and came out on the other side into the short tunnel that ended at the drop. She rigged the rope around a jutting rock at the tunnel's edge, tested it 3 times because she wasn't in a position to be wrong about it, and lowered herself down the 4-foot drop to the cavern floor. The cavern floor was not flat. It was uneven limestone, slicked in places with mineral deposits that had been forming for longer than anyone living had been alive. She had to move carefully, testing each step, because a turned ankle down here was a problem that solved itself badly. The lantern threw her shadow long and strange against the cavern wall, and the ceiling above was high enough that the light didn't reach it. She was walking in a column of illumination, surrounded by dark on every side. The lake was bigger than she'd registered from above. Standing at its edge, on a narrow shelf of stone that sloped gently into the water, she could see now what the view from the tunnel hadn't shown her. The lake curved, following the natural shape of the cavern, and the far shore was genuinely invisible, not obscured by bad light, actually beyond the range of anything she could produce. The water was so still, it looked solid until she crouched and touched it, and the cold reality of it moved against her fingers. She filled the tin bucket and brought it to her mouth and drank, same as yesterday, and it was the same that cold, mineral clarity that wasn't like well water or river water or any water she'd had before. It tasted like stone and time, if those things could have a taste, and she supposed in some configurations they could. She set the bucket down and started working along the shore to her left, moving with the lantern held low, looking at the cavern walls and the floor and the narrow shelf of stone she was walking on. She was looking for what her father had left. She knew it was here. She knew it the way you know the contents of a room you've never been in, but have heard described your whole life, a half-knowledge that becomes certainty under the right conditions. She found it 20 feet along the shore, in a natural alcove in the cavern wall where the stone had been smoothed by water action over centuries. Someone had stacked 3 flat rocks into a small platform, and on the platform sat an oilskin-wrapped package, tied with cord that had gone stiff with age and damp, but had held. Beside it, wedged upright between 2 stones, was a folded piece of paper with one word written on the outside: Maren, her name in her father's handwriting. She sat down on the canvas floor right there, because her legs had made a decision she hadn't consciously authorized, and she held the paper for a moment without opening it. The lantern flame wavered in the cold air, rising from the lake. The cavern was so quiet she could hear her own breathing, which was uneven in a way she wasn't going to apologize for. She opened the paper. It was a single page, written front and back in the small, cramped hand of a man who hadn't had much paper to waste. The date at the top was 3 years ago, 3 years before he died, which meant he had written this when he was still healthy, still working, still choosing every day to come up this mountain and keep the secret and be called a fool by a town that didn't know what he knew. If you're reading this, you broke through the wall, which means you're more stubborn than I gave you credit for, and I gave you a lot of credit. The locket was your mother's. I think you probably know that by now. I put it there because I needed you to know this was real, that your old man didn't just disappear into a mountain for nothing. This was always for something. What you're sitting next to is an aquifer. I had a geologist, a man named Horace Pruett, from Sacramento, passing through Cinder Wash in the spring of '71, look at my core samples before I understood what I had. He told me an underground water table of this size, in a range of this geography, could sustain a settlement of 1,000 people through a sustained drought without reduction. He said it in the flat way, that scientists say things that mean everything to other people, and nothing particular to themselves. I thanked him and paid him for the consultation, and didn't tell him what I'd actually found. The oilskin package contains his written assessment. It also contains the survey I did of the lake's dimensions, as best I could measure them. And it contains a document I had drawn up by a land attorney in Reno quietly, in a way that I hope Sutter never found out about, that protects the aquifer under the mineral rights clause of the original claim deed, meaning it belongs to the claim, meaning it belongs to whoever holds the claim, meaning it belongs to you now. I need you to understand why I sealed it, Maren. I need you to understand, because I'm not going to be there to argue my case, and the town is going to have things to say about your father that aren't kind. And I need you to have the reason in your hand before you decide what to do with what I found. Bramwell Sutter controls this valley because he controls the water. That is the only reason. Not intelligence, not character, not any quality you'd want to name water. He has the deepest well and the willingness to use it as leverage. And as long as that's true, 300 people in Cinder Wash are not free. They think they are. They don't know what a leash feels like until the leash pulls tight. If I had come down from this mountain and announced what I found, Sutter would have had lawyers on it before the week was out. He has money and connections and the particular talent of powerful men for turning discovery into ownership. I had neither the resources nor the time to fight him in a courtroom, and I knew it. So I made a different choice. I sealed the water, and I waited, and I accepted what accepting looked like. What I need from you is not to be angry with me. Or if you're angry, fine, be angry. But after that, figure out what I couldn't. Figure out how to give this water to the town in a way that nobody can ever take it back. Your father, Ephraim, P.S. There is a flat stone near the water's edge, approximately 30 feet to your right. I put your mother's other photograph under it. I thought she should stay near the water. Maren sat with the letter for a long time. The cavern held the silence around her the way it had held the water, without effort, without apology, as a simple fact of what it was. She was not going to describe what happened to her face in those minutes, because it was private, and it was complete, and the cavern was the only witness to it. Eventually she got up. She went 30 feet to the right and found the flat stone and lifted it, and there was a second photograph, this one slightly larger than the one in the locket. The same woman, different moment, not posed formally this time, caught in partial profile, looking at something outside the frame, with an expression that was almost a smile. An expression Maren recognized because she'd been told her whole life that she had her mother's, and she had never entirely believed it because she'd had nothing to compare it to. She believed it now. She wrapped both photographs carefully inside her jacket and picked up the Atolskin package and climbed back up to the tunnel. She spent that afternoon at camp reading what was in the package. Horace Pruitt's assessment was written in the dense technical language of a man trained to precision, but the meaning was clear enough. He described the aquifer in terms of volume and recharge rate and geological stability, and his conclusion, stated without drama, was that this water source was exceptional. Not just adequate, exceptional. The kind of find that, in settled country, would have had cities building on top of it. The legal document was more difficult to parse, but she read it 3 times until she understood the structure of it. Her father had been right. The aquifer was protected under the mineral rights clause of the Black-Finch deed, which predated the territorial water laws Sutter had been operating under. It was not ironclad, because nothing is ever ironclad, and a man with enough money could challenge anything in a court that hadn't heard the case yet. But it was something. It was a documented claim, notarized in Reno by an attorney whose name and office were on the document, and that was more than she'd had yesterday. She sat with all of it spread across her knees and thought about what her father had asked her to do. Figure out how to give this water to the town in a way that nobody can ever take it back. That was the instruction. Not how to profit from it. Not how to negotiate the best terms, how to give it in a way it stayed given, how to remove it permanently from the category of things that could be leveraged. She was 20 years old, and she had been in Cinder Wash for less than 2 weeks, and she had $300 to her name, and a legal document she'd read 3 times, and still wasn't certain she fully understood, and what her father was asking her to do was dismantle a man's power base without the resources or the standing to do it directly. She put the papers back in the oilskin and tied the cord, and held the package against her chest and looked out at the valley. Nessa Gray Willow appeared at the edge of camp the way she always did, without announcement, without particular hurry. "You found it," Nessa said. Maren looked at her. Water. An underground lake. Big enough to... She stopped, because the size of it still caught somewhere in her throat when she tried to describe it. Big enough. Nessa sat down and didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the oilskin package in Maren's hands. "He wrote me a letter," Maren said. "He planned all of it. He had legal protection on the deed. He had a geologist's assessment. She shook her head. He just needed someone to come after him and do the part he couldn't do." "And what part is that?" "Make Sutter irrelevant," Maren said, "in a way he can't undo." Nessa looked at her with that particular quality of attention that Maren had stopped finding unnerving and started finding useful, the look of someone who was evaluating not your words, but the architecture underneath them, whether the structure was sound. "Your father," Nessa said slowly, "was a man who thought in long lines. From where he was to where he wanted to get, he could see the whole distance. But he couldn't always see how to walk it." She paused. "Are you that kind of person?" "I don't know yet," Maren said honestly. "That's a better answer than most people give," Nessa said. They sat together as the afternoon light started its long lean toward evening, and Nessa talked about the valley in a way she hadn't before, not about water specifically, but about the valley's history, the years before Cinder Wash existed as a settlement, the patterns of drought and recovery she had watched over decades. Most of its windows were dark. She talked about the family when the staying got hard, and the ones who had left and why, and what the land had done in dry years, and what it had taken from people. She talked about Sutter the way you talk about weather, not with personal feeling, but with precise descriptive attention. He had arrived 12 years ago with capital from somewhere east, had bought the best positioned land, had sunk the deep well in his 2nd year, had learned quickly that in a desert territory water was more reliable currency than silver, had built a quiet empire not on aggression but on patience and on the simple mathematics of owning what people needed to survive. "He's not a cruel man," Nessa said, and it sounded like a careful distinction. "He's a practical one. Cruelty is personal. What he does is business, which is its own kind of problem. Because you can't appeal to a man's better nature if he's just doing business," Maren said. "You can only change the business," Nessa said. "Make it unprofitable to do things the way he does them." Maren looked at her.
"You've been thinking about this longer than I have."
"I've been thinking about this since before you were born," Nessa said, and there was something in her voice that was not bitterness, but was something old and tired and patient all at once. "Your father and I talked about it many times. What to do if it were possible to do anything. How you give a valley back to itself. She looked at the valley below. He decided the answer was time. Wait for the right person. Put the tools in their hands. And he picked me. Maren said, and she couldn't keep the uncertainty entirely out of her voice. The awareness that she was 20, that she was a woman, that she was an outsider in this town, that she was large in a world that treated large women as though their bodies were an argument against their competence. Nesovit's windows dark. Nessa looked at her directly. He didn't have a lot of candidates, she said, which was not the reassurance Maren might have wanted, but was honest in a way she had come to expect from this woman. But I don't think it was only that. I think he saw something in you that he trusted. He barely knew me, Maren said. He left when I was 8. That's not the same as not knowing you, Nessa said. Maren didn't answer. She held the oilskin package and thought about a man who had come up a mountain every day for 11 years and made a choice that required him to be remembered as a failure, and who had written his daughter a letter and put her mother's photograph under a flat stone beside an underground lake, and whether that constituted knowing someone, or whether it was something different, a faith that didn't require knowing. An investment in a version of a person you could only see an outline from the distance of absence. She didn't know. She thought she might not know for a long time. What she knew was what she had to do next. The next morning she walked down to Cinderwash. She hadn't been down the mountain in nearly a week, and the town felt different to her now, not changed. Exactly. But seen differently. The way a place looks when you've learned something about it that it doesn't know about itself. She walked down the main street and noticed the things she noticed. The barrels outside the general store that were used to catch rainwater, the way the public trough near the livery had a waterline mark that showed it was being filled less than it used to be. The dust in the street was deeper than it should have been this time of year. She had been so focused on the mountain that she hadn't let herself think hard about the valley floor. But the valley floor was telling its own story, quietly to anyone paying attention. Dry, not catastrophically, not yet, but drier than it should have been. She went to the land office first. The clerk who had given her the deed was there, and he gave her the same look he'd given her before the brief, assessing look that told her he was categorizing her before she finished sitting down. She put the land document on his desk, the one from the Reno attorney. "I need you to verify this," she said, "and I need to know if there's anything that supersedes it under current territorial law." He looked at the document with the expression of a man who had not expected his Tuesday to take this particular direction. He read it slowly, which told her he was reading it carefully, which told her it was saying something he hadn't expected. He read it again. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My father had it drawn up. Is it valid?" He stopped, started again. "The mineral rights clauses from the original 1869 deed, before the water diversion ordinance of 1873. If the water source is on your claim parcel and it predates the ordinance." He was talking to himself now, working through it. "It's not simple, but this is..." He picked it up and held it toward the window like he could read it better in the light. "This is a legitimate claim. Can Sutter challenge it?" "He can challenge anything," the clerk said. "That's what money is for." Then he seemed to remember who he was talking to and who her father was, and looked slightly uncomfortable. "But the structure here is solid. Whoever drafted this knew what they were doing." She took the document back and thanked him and left. She was halfway down the main street when she heard the horses. 4 of them coming from the direction of Sutter's main ranch road, moving at a pace that was too fast for casual and too controlled for emergency. The rider in front she recognized as the foreman who'd come up the mountain 3 days ago. Behind him were 3 men she didn't know, but knew the type, the kind of men who got paid for presence rather than skill. The foreman pulled up when he saw her, and the horses settled around her in a loose grouping that wasn't quite a circle, but accomplished what a circle would have. "Miss Bellrose," the foreman said. Same neutral tone as before. "Mr. Sutter would like a word." "Tell Mr. Sutter I'm busy today," she said. "He'd prefer in person." The foreman looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the 3 men behind him were quiet in the specific way of men who are waiting to be told to stop being quiet. "His office. This afternoon." "Is that an invitation or something else?" she asked. The foreman held her gaze for a moment. In that moment she saw what she'd seen before, the faint discomfort of a man executing an instruction he hadn't been asked his opinion on. "It's a request," he said. I'd take it as one. He said it with a slight emphasis on "I'd" that she caught and filed away. This afternoon, she said. I'll come, they rode on. She stood in the street and watched them go, and didn't let any of what she was feeling show on her face, which required some effort because what she was feeling was a combination of cold anger and something that felt dangerously like fear. Sutter to more than she'd assumed. Not everything if he knew everything. His foreman would not have been asking politely, but something. Maybe just instinct. Maybe someone in town had noticed something about her supply runs, her timeline, the direction her questions had taken. Maybe the doubled offer had come back to him, refused a second time, and he was rerunning his math on why a broke young woman would turn down $50. She went back up the mountain first. She needed to move the oilskin package. Not because she expected Sutter to go looking for it today, but because she had learned something about Bramwell Sutter that she wanted to be careful about. He was a man who moved through the world using other people's bad planning against them, and she was not going to hand him the opportunity. She spent an hour in the cavern, in the cold air with the lantern, finding a place in the alcove wall where the stone had cracked and formed a natural compartment. She wrapped the oilskin in a second layer of canvas, tied it, and fitted it into the crack as far as her arm could reach, covered the opening with a flat stone that fit as though it had been made for the purpose. While she was working, she found herself to the cavern, the way she'd talking to the cavern, the way she'd talked to the tunnel, the way you do when you're alone with something large, and you need the sound of your own voice to confirm you're real in it. He's going to come up here, she said, eventually. If I don't handle this right, he's going to find a way to take it. The cavern didn't answer, but the lake reflected her lantern light in shifting patterns, and the cold air moved against her face, and she found it steadying in the particular way that large, indifferent things can be steadying by being larger than the problem. She was not going to let him have it. She climbed back out and walked down to Cinder Wash for the second time that day. Sutter's office was attached to his main house on the south side of town, a room that communicated wealth without announcing it, which was its own kind of announcement. Good furniture. A desk that had been brought in at considerable expense. A window that looked out at his landholdings to the north. He was standing when she came in, which she read as calculated not sitting behind the desk, not starting from a position of obvious authority, but standing casually near the window like a man with nothing in particular to establish. Miss Bellrose, he said, thank you for coming. She sat down without being asked. You asked me here, Mr. Sutter. Let's not waste each other's time. He almost smiled. The pleasantness recalibrated again, the way it had in the boarding house. You've been busy on the mountain, he said. I have. My foreman says you've been bringing supplies up, setting up more than a temporary camp. He paused. That kind of effort suggests you found something worth staying for. I found my father's mine, she said. I'm deciding what to do with it. And what does that process look like from the outside side? He had moved to the desk now, not sitting at it, just positioning himself near it, his hands resting on the edge. Because from the outside, it looks like a young woman alone on a mountain, working very hard at something she hasn't talked to anyone about. I talk to people, she said. Nessa Grey Willow, he said. He said it in a specific way, and she understood that he had been keeping better track of her movements than she'd realized. She's been going up that ridge trail. She goes up that ridge trail, and she comes down, and she doesn't say where she's been. Nessa Grey Willow doesn't answer to you, Maren said. No, he agreed. She doesn't. He looked at her steadily. I'm going to be direct with you because I think you're a direct person and you'll appreciate that more than the other kind. He sat down at the desk now, settling into it. I've been in this valley for 12 years. I know this land the way I know my own hands. And I know that your father spent 11 years in that mountain. And I know that a man doesn't lend years on nothing, no matter how many people tell him he should stop. The room was very quiet. He found something, Sutter said. Not silver. Whatever it wasn't silver, or we'd have known by now. But something. He folded his hands. And you've found it too. She held his gaze and said nothing. I'm prepared to offer you $500 for the claim, he said. Sight unseen. $500 for whatever's in that mountain, including the legal deed, all rights transferred. You walk away with more money than your father made in his life. And you go back home and you build something. $500. Yesterday it had been $50. The mathematics of it, the speed of the escalation, told her everything she needed to know about what his instincts were saying to him. "What do you think is in the mountain?" she asked. He looked at her carefully. "I have a theory," he said. "Tell me, water," he said. One word, flat and certain, the way he'd said the mine was worth nothing in the boarding house that first morning. Except this time, the certainty was pointing in the opposite direction, and he knew it. She kept her face still. The geological surveys of this range from 15 years ago mentioned the possibility of a deep aquifer under the eastern slope, Sutter continued. "I had my own man look at it when I first came here. He said the conditions were right, but there was no way to access it. The rock formations would require tunneling from the slope face, the kind of sustained excavation that would take years." He paused. Years and a specific kind of man. The kind who didn't know when to stop because he'd convinced himself there was something worth finding. "And you think that man was my father? I think your father was the only person in this valley stubborn enough and committed enough to find it, if it was there," Sutter said, and she heard something in his voice that wasn't admiration, but was something adjacent to it, the recognition one determined person gives to another. "And I think whatever he found, you found too. And I think you understand what it means." She looked at him. At the desk and the window and the well-made furniture and the quiet power in the room that came not from anything dramatic, but from the accumulated effect of a man who had spent 12 years making sure he held the thing people needed most. I do understand what it means," she said. $500, he said again. "That's not a small offer, Miss Bellrose." "I know it isn't. I could make it more." "I know you could." He looked at her with a different quality of attention, now the look she'd seen from the foreman, from Nessa, from no one else in this town. The look of someone who was genuinely uncertain how to categorize what they were seeing. A 20-year-old woman from nowhere, heavy and tired and without resources, who had turned down 20, then 50, and was sitting here turning down $500 without a visible reaction. "What do you want?" he asked. And for the first time since she'd come to Cinderwash, the question didn't carry his assurance, the pleasant certainty that he already knew the answer. He was actually asking. She thought about her father's letter. "Figure out how to give this water to the town in a way that nobody can ever take it back. I'll let you know," she said, "when I've decided." She stood up and he didn't stop her, and she walked out of his office and down the main street of Cinderwash with her legs steady underneath her, and the locket cold against her chest, and the particular feeling of a woman who has just looked a powerful man in the eye and not blinked. Behind her, she knew Sutter was sitting at his desk recalculating. She was recalculating too, because she had seen something in his face at the end that she hadn't expected. Not rage, not contempt those she had prepared for. What she had seen was something closer to respect, which was more complicated. A man like Sutter didn't give respect without calculating its value, and if he was giving it, he was also calculating how to use it. She needed to move before he finished calculating. She climbed back up the mountain as the afternoon turned gold and long, her legs complaining on every switchback the way they had from the beginning, her breath pulling in the thin air the way it always did, her body doing what it always did, not easily, not without cost, but steadily, one step and then another. At the camp, she sat outside the lean-to as the light faded and spread the situation in front of her. It's like a set of materials she needed to build something from. She had the aquifer. She had the legal document. She had the geologist's assessment. She had the knowledge that Sutter suspected but didn't know for certain and couldn't prove without accessing the claim. She had Nessa Grey Willow, who knew the valley and its history and had her own reasons for wanting things to change. And she had the deed, which was hers, which was the most important piece of all. What she didn't have was time. Because Sutter was not a man who sat once he had decided something, and he had decided something in that room she had watched him decide it. The number would go up again, and if the number didn't work, something else would replace the number. She needed to figure out how to give this water to Cinderwash before he found another lever to use. The problem was that she didn't know how yet. She knew what the outcome needed to look like, but the distance between here and that outcome was full of legal specifics she didn't fully understand. Practical infrastructure she had no idea how to fund or build, and a town full of people who didn't trust her yet, who still looked at her and saw a fat girl from somewhere else, the failed dreamer's daughter, nothing to take seriously. She lay back on the bedroll and looked at the stars and held the locket and thought, 300 people down there in the dry dark. A man in his well-made office adding numbers. And an underground lake that had been waiting, cold and still and patient, for longer than any of them had been alive. Her father had found it and sealed it and waited. She had found it and broken through, and now she was sitting on the ridge above a town she had no right to and every obligation to, trying to figure out to be the person he believed she was. The fire burned low. She didn't rebuild it. She sat in the dark and thought, and the mountain sat around her and was what it was, and the lake was below her in the cavern, cold and real and vast. And eventually she had a thought that wasn't quite a plan, but was the beginning of one. She sat up. She knew what she needed. She needed a witness. Not just any witness, she needed someone with standing, with expertise, with a name that carried weight in this territory. Betson's. Someone who could look at what her father had found and give it words that would mean something to a court, to a land office, to the 300 people in Cinderwalk who needed to hear this from someone other than Maren Bellrose's fat daughter who'd shown up 2 weeks ago from nowhere. She needed a geologist, and she needed one before Sutter made a move. She was back on her feet before she'd finished the thought, not because there was anything to do right now, in the dark, on a mountain, but because sitting still had stopped being possible. The nearest city with the kind of professional she needed was 2 days away by stage. She had enough money for the stage fare. She looked at the tunnel entrance, dark and silent, the broken wall inside it, and the cavern below that with its impossible cold lake reflecting nothing because there was no light to reflect. "I'll be back," she told it. She wasn't sure if she was talking to the mountain or to her father or to herself, but she meant it regardless. She banked the fire, secured the camp as best she could, wrapped the photographs inside 3 layers of cloth against her body, and in the morning she went back down to Cinder Wash. She bought a stage ticket. She sent a letter ahead by a writer she paid from her remaining cash, addressed to the Nevada Territorial Geological Survey Office, requesting an urgent consultation. And then she sat in the stage depot and waited, watching the dust in Cinder Wash's Main Street and thinking about her father's hands building a wall's stone and the cold air that had come through it and a locket pressed into wet mortar and a lake that no one in this town knew was underneath them. Sutter was somewhere in this town right now, making decisions. She was going to move faster than his decisions. She had to. The stage to Carson City took 2.5 days, and Maren spent most of it wedged against the window on the right side of the coach, watching the desert move past in its slow, indifferent way, thinking about everything she couldn't control while she was sitting still. There were 3 other passengers. A merchant traveling south with 2 trunks strapped to the roof. A woman in her 40s who fell asleep before they cleared the first mile and stayed that way with impressive commitment, and a younger man who introduced himself as a land broker from Sacramento and spent the first hour trying to establish a conversation before the quality of Maren's responses convinced him to redirect his attention to the window. She wasn't trying to be rude. She simply had nothing to spend on pleasantries right now. She was running numbers in her head. Not money numbers, though those were their own problem. She had left Cinderwash with $43 and change, enough for the stage fare and a night or 2 in Carson City, and the consultation fee, if there was one, but not enough for much error. The numbers she was actually running were time. How long she'd been gone from the mountain. How long Sutter would wait before he did something. Whether the false arrangement of stones in front of the broken wall passage would hold up to a determined look, or whether it would take about 30 seconds for anyone who actually went in and looked at to understand what had happened there. She had no way to know how much time she had. That was the thing about operating without information. You couldn't calculate the risk, only feel it. And feeling it for 2.5 days on a stagecoach, with no ability to do anything about it, was its own particular kind of punishment. She arrived in Carson City on a Wednesday afternoon. The city felt enormous after Cinderwash not actually enormous. It was a small territorial capital, but after weeks on a mountain and in a dying settlement, the noise and density and the simple fact of multiple people moving in multiple directions with purposes she couldn't guess felt like a different country. She found a boarding house 2 streets from the main road, paid for 1 night, and went to bed at 7 in the evening and didn't move until 5 the next morning. The Territorial Geological Survey Office opened at 8. She was there at 10 minutes before 8, sitting on the bench outside with the oilskin package on her lap, wearing the cleanest version of the clothes she had, which was not very clean. She had done what she could, with water and a cloth in the boarding house basin, but she was a woman who had been living rough on a mountain for 3 weeks, and there was a limit to what could be accomplished in a basin. The man who opened Loswood's dark door looked at her with a familiar brief assessment and then held the door for her, which was something. His name was Arthur Crail, according to the sign on the inner office door, and he was the deputy surveyor for the Eastern District, which was what the letter she'd sent had gotten her, not the chief surveyor, who was apparently traveling, but his deputy, who came across initially as the kind of civil servant who handles everything slightly below the threshold of his attention. Miss Bellrose, he said, reading from the letter she'd sent, you wrote about a geological consultation, a private claim in the Cinder Wash area. Blackfinch claim, she said. My father's, I inherited it. Yes. He had the letter in front of him and was reading it again, which told her he hadn't read it carefully the first time. You mention an aquifer, an underground lake, she said. I've been in it. I've touched the water. I have my father's original documentation from a geologist named Horace Pruett, who assessed core samples in 1871 and a survey estimate of the lake's dimensions. Crail looked up from the letter. Pruett, he said. Horace Pruett from Sacramento? You know him? He was one of the better independent geologists working this territory in the early 70s. He died in 74. He set the letter down. You have his written assessment? She put the oilskin package on his desk and untied the cord and laid out her father's documents, the Pruett assessment, the survey, the legal deed document. She laid them out carefully, in the order she'd decided was most persuasive. Evidence first, legal protection second. Crail read slowly. He was one of those people who read with their whole face, expressions shifting as the text shifted, which she found useful. She could watch him encounter each thing and register his reaction before he had time to compose it into something more professional. When he got to the Pruett assessment, he stopped performing neutrality. He estimated the volume at Crail looked up. This number is very large. I know. Pruett was conservative. He didn't overstate things. If he wrote this number, he went back to the document. Read it again. Miss Bellrose, where exactly is this claim in relation to the valley floor? She told him. She described the tunnel, the false wall, the passage, the drop, the cavern, the lake. She described the air temperature differential, the quality of the water, the limestone formations she'd seen at the water's edge. She described it the way she had come to know it, not from the outside, as a theoretical thing, but from the inside, as a place she had been. He listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he was taking her seriously. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, I need to see it. I know, she said. That's why I came. I can leave Friday. I need you to leave tomorrow, she said. He looked at her. I understand it's short notice. I understand it's an inconvenience. But I have a man in that valley who knows something is in that mountain, and the longer I'm away from it, the more time he has to act on that knowledge. She held his gaze. I need you there, and I need your official assessment on record before he finds a way to muddy the water, literally and otherwise. He studied her for a long moment. The consultation fee is standard regardless of travel time, he said finally. I'll need reimbursement for the stage. Agreed. And if what you're describing is what Pruett says it is, he tapped the assessment. This will need to go to the full commission. It can't stay a private matter. That's what I want, she said. That's exactly what I want. They left the next morning. The stage back was harder, not physically, though that was also true, but psychologically, because she was going back now, and she had done what she'd gone to do, but she was also 2.5 days away from Cinder Wash, and the mountain, and the sealed cavern, and 2.5 days was a long time if Sutter had decided to stop being patient. Crail was better company than she'd expected. He was a man who was genuinely interested in the world, in the specific way that people who have spent their careers looking at rocks are interested. He saw things through and beneath surfaces, had opinions about geological formations the way other people have opinions about weather. And when she asked him questions about aquifer systems, he answered them in full, rather than giving her the simplified version she suspected he initially assumed she'd prefer. She learned things on that stage ride. About how underground water moved through limestone and granite. about recharge rates and what determined whether an aquifer refilled seasonally or over centuries, about what made a water source exceptional rather than merely adequate, and why the specific location of what she'd found under a mountain range in a geological formation that acted as a natural filter was the kind of thing hydrologists wrote papers about. Your father's assessment was right, Crail said on the second day, looking at the Pruitt document for what she'd noticed was the third time. The formation is what this describes. This wouldn't just sustain cinder wash. It could sustain development 3 times this size. I don't want development 3 times that size, she said. He looked at her. What do you want? I want 300 people to have water they can't be charged for, she said. I want that to be permanent. And I want the cavern protected so nobody can drain it or contaminate it or build something over it that breaks it. Crail was quiet for a moment. That's a legal and administrative question, not a geological one. I know. I'm asking you to be the geological part. I'm working on the rest. What is the rest? She looked at him. I'll let you know when I have it sorted. They arrived in Cinder Wash on a Saturday morning, and she knew immediately that something had changed while she was gone. The town felt different. Not wrong, exactly. Not the specific wrongness of something bad having already happened, but tighter. The way a room feels when a conversation has just stopped because someone walked in. The woman at the boarding house where she'd first stayed looked at her with an expression that mixed relief and something harder to name. You came back, the woman said. I said I would. People didn't know whether to believe that, the woman said. She looked at Crail, who was standing with his survey bag and his professional detachment. Who's this? Arthur Crail. Territorial Geological Survey. Maren kept her voice level. What happened while I was gone? The woman glanced around the way people do when they're checking who's in earshot. Sutter's men went up the mountain, she said, day before yesterday. 4 of them. They were up there for about 3 hours. Maren's stomach dropped. Did they go into the tunnel? She asked. Don't know. Nobody knows. They came back down and nobody said anything. Sutter didn't say anything. And then yesterday, Sutter sent word around that he was temporarily suspending the public water allocation from his well. Said it was maintenance. The woman's voice was carefully neutral, the way voices get when a person is describing an injustice they're trying not to feel too directly, because feeling it directly would require them to do something about it. People are drawing from the river bend, but it's low. It's been low all summer. Maren looked at Crail. He looked back at her. We need to go up the mountain, she said. Now. They went up the trail at a pace that her body informed her was optimistic, given that she had been on a stagecoach for 2 days. But she didn't slow down because she couldn't afford what slowing down might mean. Crail was fit enough to keep up, though he was breathing harder than he probably wanted to by the time they reached the mine entrance. Camp was undisturbed. Or looked undisturbed. The firing was cold, and the lean-to was as she'd left it, but she had arranged things in a specific way before she left, small indicators that only she would recognize, and 2 of them were different. Someone had been here, had touched things, moved things, tried to put them back. She went into the tunnel. The stone arrangement in front of the passage opening was different. Not gone, not obviously disassembled, but moved. Someone had looked at it, pulled at the edges, maybe not pushed through, but definitely investigated the perimeter of it, and then either decided it was a natural collapse or decided to come back later with better equipment or more authority. She didn't know which. She needed it to be the first option. In here, she said, and Crail followed her through the tunnel, ducking at the lower section, saying nothing about the cramped conditions in the professional way of someone who spends time in tight spaces. She moved the stones from the passage opening and went through first, then helped him through, and he straightened up in the short tunnel beyond and looked around. He didn't get here, she said, half to herself, looking at the passage ahead. If he had, he wouldn't have put the stones back. Is there a reason to believe someone was here? Yes. She moved forward. Come on. She brought him to the edge and they stood there together, and she held both lanterns. She'd retrieved hers, and he'd brought his own, and the combined light reached further than it had before, and she watched Arthur Crail, deputy surveyor for the Eastern District, look at an underground lake for the first time. He didn't speak for a long time. How far does it extend? He finally asked. I don't know. I couldn't find the far shore. He crouched at the edge of the drop, and she lowered him the rope, and he climbed down and she followed, and he walked the near shore with his lantern low, And she watched him do what she had watched herself do, the gradual physical understanding of a space that was larger than expectation. He took measurements. He had a notebook and he filled 6 pages of it while she sat on the limestone shelf and waited, and he tested the water and looked at the formation of the cavern walls and the ceiling where she'd told him she couldn't reach with light. And he did all of this methodically in the quiet way of a man who is building a picture that he wants to be complete before he says anything about it. Your father's estimate was conservative, he said finally, standing at the water's edge with his notebook closed in his hand. Pruett's was closer, but still conservative. She waited. He stopped. She watched him decide what language to use. Miss Bellrose, this aquifer could sustain a city of 4,000 people through a multi-year drought without meaningful reduction in volume. The recharge rate from the surrounding range, given the geology, is exceptional. Closed basin system with a natural limestone filtration layer. That he stopped again. This is not what I expected to find. What did you expect? Something smaller. Something that would have needed qualification. He looked at the lake. This doesn't need qualification. This is one of the most significant water resources I have seen in 20 years of survey work. She closed her eyes briefly. Not from relief, or not only from relief. From the weight of what her father had carried, knowing this was here, going back down to Cinderwash every day, and saying nothing and letting them call him a fool. 20 years in survey work, and this man she's never seen anything like it. And her father had found it alone and sealed it and carried it until he couldn't anymore. I need your official assessment, she said in writing, filed with the Territorial Commission. I'll begin it tonight, Crail said. They climbed back out, and Maren resealed the passage as best she could. And they went back to camp, and Crail sat at the edge of the fire she built and began writing in his notebook. And Maren sat across from him and thought about Sutter's men being up here 2 days ago. She thought about the suspended water allocation. She had been wrong about one thing. She had thought she had more time. Sutter was not waiting for her to come back and make a decision. He was applying pressure, because pressure was the tool he understood. And if the well ran dry for a few days, if the families of Sinsuquash spent a week drawing river water that tasted of iron and dust, they would be ready to take whatever terms Sutter offered when the well mysteriously came back online. And Maren Bellrose, wherever she'd gone, would look like someone who had run rather than a woman who had gone to get what she needed. How quickly can you file the assessment? She asked. Crail looked up from his notebook. 2 weeks for the full report, but I can file a preliminary finding as early as Monday. That would go on public record immediately. Do that, she said. File the preliminary Monday. I'll need to go back to Carson City to do it. I know. Go tomorrow morning. She looked at him. The preliminary, does it establish my claim to the aquifer under the mineral rights provision? It would reference the deed and Pruett's prior assessment, and my own current findings, he said carefully. It wouldn't be a legal ruling, but it would make the public record before any challenge, which means anyone trying to contest your claim would be contesting a filed territorial survey document, not just your word. That's what I need, she said. He nodded and went back to writing. Maren stayed up long after he went to sleep in the lean-to, sitting by the fire and looking at the valley below where the lights were sparse. And the darkness was the kind that comes from a community going to bed early, because there isn't enough energy left for anything else. She could see from here that the public trough near the livery was empty. Even at night, the moon showed her that much. Sutter had moved his clock up. Fine, so had she. In the morning, Crail went down the mountain and she went to see Nessa. She found her on the eastern trail where she'd come to expect. Her Nessa moved in patterns, not rigid schedules, but patterns, most of its windows. And Maren had started to understand them the way you understand a person's habits when you've been paying attention. She told Nessa what she'd found in the cavern. All of it, the letter, the photograph, the Pruett assessment, Crail's reaction. She laid it out plainly, without drama, the same way she'd laid the documents on Crail's desk. Nessa listened without interrupting. When Maren finished, Nessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" "The families," Maren said. "The ones who are struggling most with the water. I need to know who they are and whether they'd be willing to hear something from me. Not yet, not today. But soon." Nessa looked at her. "They'll hear you," she said. "Some of them. The ones who have been here long enough to be tired of being afraid." She paused. Some of them won't. Some of them have made their peace with things as they are. I know. I just need some. Why? Because when I do this, I need witnesses who aren't Sutter's people, Maren said. I need people who can say they were there and they saw it and they understood what it was before anyone had a chance to reframe it into something else. Nessa looked at her with the absorbing dark eyes. Your father said something like that once, she said, about needing the right witnesses. What did he say? He said the truth is only as durable as the people who see it, Nessa said. That a truth without witnesses is just a story someone tells. Maren held that for a moment. He was smarter than they gave him credit for, she said. Most people are, Nessa said. She went back to the mountain and spent the next 2 days waiting, which was the hardest thing she had done since she got here, including breaking through the wall. Waiting required a different kind of endurance, not physical, but the kind that comes from holding a decision in place while the conditions around it keep shifting. She checked the passage every morning. She monitored the camp for signs of another visit. She kept her fire small and her movements quiet, not hiding exactly, but not advertising herself either. On the second day, the Calloway family appeared. She heard them before she saw them, a wagon on the lower trail, moving slowly, the particular laboring sound of a team that had been pushed too hard in too much heat. She came to the edge of the camp and looked down, and the wagon had stopped on the switchback below. Not because of any mechanical problem, but because the man driving it had stopped driving it and was just sitting there with the reins in his hands and his head down. She went down. The wagon held a man and woman in their 30s and 2 children and what appeared to be everything they owned, loaded in the careful, compressed way of people who have packed to leave. The man's name was Del Calloway. The woman was Ruth. Most of its windows were dark. The children, a girl of about 7 and a boy, who looked 4 or 5 and was lying in the back of the wagon with a blanket over him that was too heavy for the temperature. We're headed for Elko, Del Calloway said without looking up. He said it with the specific flatness of a man who has made a decision that cost him everything and is holding himself together by not talking about it. Heard there's work up there. Maren looked at the boy in the wagon. He was flushed. The flush of fever, not heat. His lips were dry and cracked. How long has he been like this? She asked. Ruth Calloway looked at her from the wagon's seat, a look that was simultaneously guarded and desperate in the way of a woman who has been managing a crisis without help and has learned to be suspicious of offers. Since yesterday, she said. He can't keep water down. Where are you getting water from? River Bend, Del said. Same as everyone. He finally looked up. His eyes were the eyes of a man who hadn't slept in at least 2 days. It's not it hasn't been right. The taste of it. The river Bend at low summer levels, everyone drawing from it now that Sutter's well was locked. The kind of water that picked things up when it ran slow and shallow over a summer riverbed. Not safe. Not reliably safe. Maren looked at the boy. She thought about her father's letter. He was protecting it until someone could be trusted to share it. She had been trying to plan this correctly. She had been thinking about witnesses and legal filings and the right sequence of events that would prevent Sutter from finding a way to contest what she did. She had a process mapped out in her head, the order in which things needed to happen to be irrevocable. She looked at the boy and the process unmapped itself. Come up the mountain, she said. Del looked at her. What? There's clean water up there. Good water. Come up. Ruth Calloway looked at her with a different quality now, not the guarded assessment of before, but something more searching. Who are you? Maren Bellrose. The claim up there is mine. She looked at the boy again. He was the color of things that should be cooler. Please, bring him up. They came. The wagon couldn't make the upper trail, so Del carried the boy, and Ruth carried what she needed, and the girl walked beside her mother and held her hand, and Maren went ahead. She moved faster than her legs wanted to, the uphill pull doing what it always did it. Her lungs making their familiar complaint about the altitude, and she pushed through all of it because the boy in Del Calloway's arms was the weight that mattered right now. At the camp, she had Del set the boy down in the lean-to where it was shaded, and she went into the tunnel. She didn't explain. She took the bucket and worked through the passage in the practiced way. She had by now left shoulder down, hips turned, over the drop and went to the lake's edge, and filled the bucket with the cold, clean, impossible water and carried it back out. It took 3 trips. Her arms were shaking by the 3rd one. She brought Ruth Calloway a tin cup of it, and Ruth smelled at first the instinct of a mother who had learned it to be, and then tasted it herself before she would give it to her son, and whatever she tasted in it made her close her eyes briefly. She gave the boy the cup. He drank. He kept it down. Ruth Calloway looked at Maren over her son's head with an expression that Maren didn't try to interpret because it was too large to interpret. She just nodded. Del Calloway had been watching from the edge of the lean-to. He walked over to where Maren was sitting and stood there for a moment. "Where is this water from?" he asked. She looked at him, at his wife, at his daughter sitting next to her brother with her small hand on his arm. At the wagons down the slope, loaded with everything they had, pointed toward Elko because Cinder Wash had run out of reasons to stay. "From the mountain," she said. "From inside the mountain. There's a lake under there, Del. Big enough to run this valley for longer than any of us will be alive." Del Calloway stared at her. "Who knows about this?" he said. "Me. Sutter suspects it. And a territorial surveyor who's filing the official assessment in Carson City on Monday." "Monday," Del repeated. He was doing the same thing she did, running the timeline, calculating the gap between now and when something was official and protected and beyond casual interference. "Yes," she said. He looked at the tunnel entrance. "What do you need?" She hadn't expected the question. Or she had wanted witnesses, had told Nessa she needed people who would see what this was and be able to say so. But she hadn't expected it to come this simply from a man she'd just met, offered in the same direct way you'd offer to help stack wood. "Stay," she said. "Stay here tonight. And tomorrow, when we go back down the mountain," he said, "we're not going to Elko." She looked at him. "Not until this is settled," he said. He said it quietly, without drama, the way people commit to things when the commitment comes from somewhere deeper than impulse. He looked at the boy who had fallen asleep with the cup still in his hand. Ruth's fingers curved around his forehead. "We're not leaving while this is still whatever this is." She nodded. She spent the rest of that afternoon sitting outside the lean-to with Ruth and Del and the girl, whose name was Clara, and she explained everything. Not the abbreviated version, not the version edited for impact. The whole thing: her father, the letter, the wall, the locket, Pruett's assessment Crail, Sutter's visit while she was gone, the suspended well allocation, the document in Carson City that would be on public record by Monday. Del asked questions. Good ones. The kind that came from listening carefully and knowing which details mattered. Ruth asked fewer, but they went deeper, the kind of questions that cut to the structural issue rather than the surface narrative. "If Sutter challenges your deed before Monday," Ruth said, "what happens?" "The preliminary filing goes in Monday regardless," Maren said. "Can't be blocked retroactively. The challenge would have to go through the commission, and that takes months. And between now and Monday?" Maren was quiet for a moment. "I need to make sure he can't access the cavern," she said. "Most of its windows were dark, and I need to make sure that when the filing goes in, there are people in Cinderwash who already know what's there, who've seen it, or touched the water, or know enough that it can't be buried in paperwork." "You need the town to know," Del said. "I need enough of the town to know," she said. "Enough that Sutter can't quietly deal with me and then claim the whole thing never existed." Most of its windows were dark. Del and Ruth looked at each other in the way of people who have been together long enough that they can have most of a conversation in a glance. "I know people," Del said. "Families who aren't going to Elko yet, who've been here long enough to remember when Sutter didn't own the water." He looked at Maren. "I can talk to them. I'm not asking anyone to fight Sutter," she said. "I'm asking people to be witnesses to something real." "That's enough," Ruth said quietly. "For some of them, that'll be enough." That night, the 4 adults sat around the fire while the children slept in the lean-to, and Maren listened to Del and Ruth talk about Cinderwash in the way that only people who have actually lived somewhere can talk about it, not the shape of the town, but the texture of it, the specific people and their specific stubbornnesses and loyalties and fears. Who could be trusted? Who was too far inside Sutter's economic orbit to move freely? Who had been waiting, maybe without knowing they were waiting, for something to change? It was not a simple picture. Towns never are. There were people who would stand with her, and people who would stand with Sutter, and people who would wait to see which way the tide ran before they committed to anything. And the last group was probably the largest, and also, in some ways, the most important, because a tide that was clearly running one direction tended to bring that group with it. She needed the tide to run clearly. Sunday came cold and overcast, a pressure change moving in from the west that made the air smell different. Maren went into the cavern 3 times not for water, though she brought water each time, but because she needed to confirm for herself that it was still there, still intact. The lake still dark and still and impossibly patient behind the broken wall her father had built. On the 3rd trip, she sat at the water's edge and said, out loud, into the cold air that rose from the surface, "I'm going to do it tomorrow." She didn't know if it was for her father, or for herself, or simply for the fact that saying a thing out loud makes it more real, makes it harder to retreat from. Climbed back up. Dell had gone down to town and come back, and he had brought 3 people with him, a man named Jonas Pete, who ran the feed store, a woman named Carol Marsh, whose husband had left 2 years ago and who had stayed with her 2 daughters anyway, and an older man, perhaps 65, who Dell introduced simply as Abe. Most of its windows were dark, and who shook Maren's hand in the way of someone who was accustomed to judging people quickly and had already made a preliminary judgment that was not unfavorable. She brought them water from the cavern. Not into the cavern, not yet. She brought it out in the bucket and let them drink from the tin cups she had, and watched them react to it the way she had reacted the first time, and the way Ruth had reacted, and the way everyone reacted, who was tasting water that came from a source older and cleaner than anything they had encountered. Jonas Pete held the cup and looked at it. "Where is this from?" he said. "The mountain," she said. "Would you like to see?" She took them all in, one at a time, because the passage would only allow one at a time, and each of them stood at the edge of the drop and looked at the lake below with their lanterns. And none of them said very much, because there wasn't much to say. The lake said it for itself. When they were all back outside in the fading Sunday light, standing around her camp with the valley below and the mountain above, Abe, the older man, looked at her for a long time. "Your father found this," he said. "He did, and he sealed it up." "He did." Abe nodded slowly. He had the look of someone reassembling a picture he'd been holding in pieces for a long time, finally fitting the pieces into the shape they'd always been trying to make. "I always thought Maren Bellrose was more stubborn than stupid," he said. Most people got the two confused. "Most people did," she said. "What happens tomorrow?" Carol Marsh asked. She had the directness of someone who had been solving practical problems alone for 2 years and had stopped being interested in preamble. "Tomorrow the territorial survey filing goes in, Maren said. "The aquifer becomes part of the official public record under my claim deed. At that point, it would take a court action to challenge it, and a court action takes time." She looked at each of them. "And tomorrow, I go to Sutter and I tell him it's done." She said it like she was certain. She was not certain. She was afraid, in the specific way of a person who can see exactly what they need to do and exactly what it might cost them. But she had learned something in the past 3 weeks on this mountain, in this tunnel, in the cold dark of a cavern her father had found and sealed and left for her to open. She had learned that the feeling of being afraid of something and the act of doing it anyway were not opposites. They were, in fact, the same step. The fire burned down, and one by one, the others found their places to sleep, Dell and Ruth and their children in the lean-to, the others around the fire in whatever arrangement suited them. Maren sat last, watching the valley below, and thought about the boy who had kept water down and was sleeping in the lean-to with his hand curled against his chin. And she thought about her father, who had sat on this same ridge looking at this same valley, and had chosen every day to keep faith with a decision that required him to look like he had nothing. She had the locket in her hand. She held it until the fire went to coals. Then she lay down in her bedroll and closed her eyes and waited for Monday. She woke before anyone else. The sky was still the dark blue of pre-dawn, the kind of dark that has already decided to become morning but hasn't committed to it yet. The fire was cold ash. Del Calloway's breathing was steady from inside the lean-to, and Carol Marsh had fallen asleep, sitting up against a rock, and somehow stayed that way. Maren lay in her bedroll for exactly 1 minute, looking up at the fading stars, and then she got up. She did not feel ready. She had expected, in the way you sometimes expect things that don't materialize, to wake up Monday morning with some clarity that hadn't been available to her the night before. Some settled certainty. What she felt instead was the same thing she'd felt since she'd sat down in that boarding house, across from Bramwell Sutter, 11 days ago, a cold awareness of the distance between where she was and where she needed to get. and the specific fear that the distance was too far and her legs were too tired and she would not make it across. She went into the tunnel anyway. She didn't bring the bucket this time. She went in with only the lantern and went through the passage and lowered herself to the cavern floor and walked to the water's edge in the dark and the cold, and she stood there for a while in the particular silence of the underground, which was not the silence of absence, but the silence of something very old that had stopped needing to make noise to prove it existed. She thought about her father standing here. He had stood on this exact shelf of limestone, looking at this exact water, and he had understood what he had, and understood what would happen to it if he told the wrong people at the wrong time, in the wrong way, and he had made a choice that required him to go back down that mountain and be looked at the way they looked at him for 11 years. The way they looked at Maren when she came to claim what he'd left her. That particular compound look of dismissal and pity that people give when they have already decided you are not a serious person. He had taken that look every day and come back up here and kept faith with what he knew. Crouched at the water's edge and put her hand in. The cold moved up her wrist and into her forearm the way it always did a physical fact. Undeniable. The cold of water that had never been warm. She held her hand there until the cold became something she had absorbed, rather than something being done to her. Then she stood up, and she was done with the part of this that was about fear. She climbed back out. By the time the others were waking, she had the fire going and water boiling, and she had been thinking for 2 hours, which was enough thinking. Jonas Pete sat up from his bedroll and looked at her across the fire with the evaluating look of a man who was deciding whether last night had been real or whether morning would put it in a different category. Still Monday, she said, before he asked anything. He almost smiled. What time do you want to go down? After the stage would have left Carson City, she said. Crail will have been at the survey office when it opened. By 9 o'clock here, the preliminaries should be filed or close enough that an hour either way won't matter. And thence we go to Sutter, Dell said. He was standing at the lean-to entrance, already dressed, his boy sitting up behind him with color in his face that hadn't been there yesterday. Better. The child looked better. Dell had noticed, too, the specific way a father's shoulders drop half an inch when a child's fever breaks. And then we go to Sutter, Maren confirmed. Ruth appeared beside her husband and handed him a tin cup and looked at Maren over the rim of her own. All of us? She said. Maren looked at the group. Dell, Ruth, their children, Jonas Pete, Carol Marsh Abe. 7 people, including herself and 2 of them children. She thought about what it would look like, walking into Cinderwash. 7 people coming down a mountain that had been dismissed as worthless for a decade. A heavy young woman at the front of that group, wearing a dead man's coat, carrying a legal document and a geologist's preliminary assessment and absolutely nothing else. All of us, she said. Nessa appeared on the ridge trail at 8 o'clock, which Maren had expected in the way she had come to expect Nessa, not with certainty about when, but with certainty that she would. She came into camp and looked at the assembled group, and her expression did not change in any visible way, but something in her bearing shifted, the way a person's bearing shifts when they see something they have been waiting for a long time. She looked at Maren, said. Nessa nodded once. I need to ask you something, Maren said, before we go down. She waited until the others were occupied with the remains of breakfast, and she and Nessa were at the edge of camp where the valley was visible below. My father's letter said he was waiting for someone he could trust. He meant me. But she stopped, organized it. He couldn't have done any of this without you. He came to you about the water. You kept his secret for however many years. 3 years, Nessa said. Why? Why did you keep it? Nessa looked at the valley for a moment. Most of its windows were dark. The morning light was coming in flat from the east, the kind of light that shows you things rather than making them look better than they are. From up here, you could see the dry line of the river bend, which was lower than it should be. You could see Sutter's ranch to the south, the windmill over his well standing still in the morning air. Because he asked me to, Nessa said. And because I had been watching this valley for 40 years, and I knew what happened when men like Sutter got hold of things that didn't belong to them. The same thing that always happens. She paused. Your father was the first person who came to me in 40 years and asked what the land was rather than what it was worth. Those are different questions. And me? Maren asked. You didn't know me. No, Nessa said, but I knew how you climbed the mountain the first day. And I knew what you did when Sutter threw money at your feet. Maren was quiet for a moment. That's not much to go on. It's more than most people give me, Nessa said, and there was the faintest dry quality to it that was as close to humor as Nessa ever got. And Maren felt it the way you feel the warmth of something small in a cold place disproportionately, gratefully. They went down the mountain at 9:15, 8 of them, with Maren at the front, moving down the switchback trail in the thin morning air, with the valley opening up below them, and Cinder Wash laid out in the flat middle distance, its rooftops catching the light. The Callaway boy rode on his father's back for the steeper sections and walked on his own for the flatter ones, which he insisted on with the specific stubbornness of a child proving something. Clara Callaway held her mother's hand. Abe moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had been walking difficult ground for 6 decades and had learned what pace was sustainable. Nobody talked much on the way down. Maren's legs burned on the descent the way they always did, going down on the up. The strain landing on different muscles, the knees taking the negotiation with the slope. She was tired in a way that had accumulated over 3 weeks and was now simply a condition rather than a complaint. Her hands inside the coat pockets were wrapped in fresh cloth over the blisters that had healed to calluses and then been reopened and healed again. She thought about Crail in the survey office in Carson City, writing out the preliminary assessment. She thought about the words he had used, exceptional, one of the most significant water resources I have seen in 20 years of survey work. The words of a civil servant who underplayed things as a professional practice, using the word exceptional like it was a last resort. She held that and walked. They came into Cinder Wash on the North Road, which was not the most direct route, but was the one that passed the public trough near the livery. The trough was empty. A woman was standing beside it with 2 buckets, looking at it with the expression of someone who had already done this calculation and not liked the answer. She looked up when the group came past, and her eyes went to Maren, and then to the group, and then to the tin cup Maren was carrying, which had water in it, visible water, clean-looking water that was not from the river bend. "Where is that from?" the woman asked. "The mountain," Maren said. She stopped walking. "It's from an aquifer under Blackfinch Claim. There's a lake under there, large enough to run this valley indefinitely." She said it the way Crail had given her his findings flat, without drama, the way you say things when you want them to land as facts rather than claims. "The Territorial Survey Office is filing the official assessment this morning. The water belongs to the claim, which is mine, and I'm giving permanent access to Cinder Wash under a community covenant today." The woman stared at her. "Do you want some?" Maren said, and held out the cup. The woman took it, drank, held it in her mouth for a moment the way people do when something is better than they expected, when their body is recognizing a quality their mind hasn't caught up to yet. Swallowed. She looked at the cup. "Come to the square this afternoon," Maren said. "Bring anyone who will come." They went to Sutter's office first. She had thought about whether to do this before or after the square, and had decided before because she did not want Sutter hearing about what was happening from someone else and arriving at the square on his own terms. She wanted to look at him when she told him. She wanted him to hear it from her face, not from rumor. The foreman was outside the office, and he saw her coming with 7 people at her back, and his expression went through 2 or 3 calculations in quick succession. He didn't move to stop her. He opened the office door and stepped aside in a single motion that told her more than he probably intended, the motion of a man who had already privately located himself on a particular side of this. Sutter was at his desk. He looked at her. He looked at the people behind her, Dell and Ruth, Jonas Pete, Carol Marsh, Abe, Nessa Gray Willow last, and she watched him do what she imagined he was very good at, which was reading the meaning of an arrangement. The meaning of these particular people on a Monday morning coming in from the direction of the mountain. He already knew. Not the details, but the shape of it. She could see it in the way his face settled. Not into anger, not even into the pleasant distance he'd been using with her since that first morning, into something more still. The expression of a man who has felt the ground shift and is standing very carefully while he decides what to do about it. "Miss Bellrose," he said, "Mr. Sutter." She came to the desk and put a copy of the deed down in front of him, not the original, which was back in the oilskin in the cavern wall, but the copy she'd had the land office clerk make on Saturday. The Territorial Survey Office in Carson City is filing a preliminary assessment this morning for an aquifer under Blackfinch claim. I've been in it. Your surveyor was in it, or close enough to the passage to know something was there. Arthur Crail from the Eastern District Survey Office has been in it, and his assessment of the volume and viability is on record as of today. Sutter looked at the deed copy, did not touch it. The Mineral Rights Clause protects the aquifer under the original 1,869 claim, she continued. The Land Office clerk confirmed the structure of the protection on Saturday. It would take a court challenge to contest it, and a court challenge requires standing that you don't have in relation to a claim that was legally filed before any territorial water ordinance you'd try to invoke. She had practiced that last sentence. She had said it to herself on the mountain until it came out straight. Sutter was quiet for a long moment, and she looked at his hands because she had learned that people's hands often said what their faces were managing not to. His hands were very still. How large is the aquifer? He said. Large enough that your well is no longer the only water in this valley, she said. That's all you need to know for this conversation. Something moved across his face. Not rage. She had prepared for rage and had found something she was almost disappointed it wasn't, because rage would have been simpler. What moved across his face was more complicated. A recalculation. A man who had built 12 years of structural advantage around a single resource, looking at a world in which that resource had just become irrelevant and trying to locate himself in that world. Your father, he said slowly. Found it about 7 years ago, she said. Sealed it. Spent the rest of his life letting people think he'd failed. Another silence. Sutter stopped, started again. That was not a small sacrifice. No, she said. It wasn't. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had come to Cinder Wash, the look did not contain any of the categories she'd been filed under, not the dismissal, not the patient condescension, not the calculation of how little it would take to make her problem go away. He looked at her as though he was seeing something he hadn't budgeted for. You're not going to negotiate, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm going to grant community access to the aquifer under a covenant that makes it permanently non-private, she said, which means nobody can own it, sell it, or charge for it, including me. She held his gaze. Your well is your business. I'm not asking for your well. I'm telling you that the valley now has a second option, and the exception has no lock on the pump. The room was very quiet. Sutter looked at the deed copy for a long moment. Then, he looked at Nessa Graywillifo, who had said nothing and was standing near the door with the quality of stillness she always carried. Something passed between them that Maren couldn't quite interpret, not a message, exactly, but a recognition. Two people who had been in a valley a long time, looking at each other across what had just changed. You understand this ends my water arrangement, Sutter said, to the room, not specifically to Maren. Yes, she said. I'll challenge the Mineral Rights Clause, he said, without particular heat. My lawyers will find something. They might, she said. That's your right. But the preliminary assessment goes into public record today, and this valley knows about the aquifer today, and by the time any legal challenge resolves itself, she looked at him steadily. You won't have leverage, Mr. Sutter. Because leverage is what happens when one person has something everybody needs and can decide who gets it. That's not the situation anymore. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he nodded. A single, slow nod, the kind that doesn't concede the argument, but acknowledges that the argument is over. She picked up the deed copy from his desk. I'd unlock the well, she said on her way to the door. People need water, while the pipeline gets built. It'll take months to connect the aquifer to the town properly, and in the meantime they'll still need your well. She paused at the door. It's a chance to be on the right side of the history of this place, if you want it. She didn't wait for his answer. Outside, Del Calloway looked at her. How did it go? He asked. He'll challenge, she said. Doesn't matter. Come on. The square that afternoon was not the orderly meeting Maren had half imagined in the organized part of her brain that liked things to go according to plans. It was messier than that, and more human than that, and ultimately more real than that. People came in the way people come to things they've heard about secondhand and aren't sure what to make of cautiously. At first, then in larger groups once the first groups had arrived and not left, because presence is its own endorsement, and if Jonas Pete and Carol Marsh and Abe, who between them represented several decades of Cinder Wash continuity, were standing in the square listening to something, other people would come to listen too. Maybe 60 people showed up. Maybe a few more. Not the whole town. There were people who stayed away because Sutter's economic reach extended into their lives in specific ways they weren't prepared to test. And she didn't blame them for that and wasn't going to pretend she didn't understand it. Life was full of people who made reasonable choices in impossible circumstances, and she was not going to be the kind of person who looked down from a mountain and called that cowardice. She stood in the middle of the square and talked. She was not a natural speaker. She had not given speeches before. Her voice came out slightly too fast at the beginning because her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, and she had to consciously slow herself down. She was aware of being looked at the whole town's look all at once, which was different from individual people's looks, which was already something she'd had to make her peace with. She was aware of her size, her rumpled condition, the coat she was still wearing because she still couldn't take it off, the cloth-wrapped hands. She told them about the aquifer. She told them about her father, all of it the 11 years, the real timeline, what he found and when and why he sealed it. She told them about the letter and the locket and Horace Pruett and Arthur Crail's assessment. She told them about the legal protection under the deed. She held up the covenant document she had written herself in her own handwriting with the land office clerk's notarization, which she had obtained on Saturday before she knew if she'd even have time to execute it, a document that granted permanent community access to the aquifer under terms that prevented any private ownership, any sales, any charging for access ever. She was not eloquent. There were sentences that came out sideways, and one moment where she lost her place entirely and had to stop and find it again. And nobody in the square said anything during that pause, which was its own kind of grace. She just found her place and kept going. When she finished, there was a silence. Then Abe, the older man who had shaken her hand on the mountain and said her father was more stubborn than stupid, said, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, "I'd like to see it." She took them up. Not 60 people, not all at once, not up that trail, not possible. She took them in groups over the rest of that day and into the next morning. Groups of 8 and 10 up the switchback trail, into the tunnel, through the passage. She helped each person through the tight section the same way she'd helped Crail left shoulder here. Hips this way. The broken edge catches if you're not careful. Most windows were dark. She lowered each group to the cavern floor and walked them to the water's edge and held the lantern and let the light fail in the distance of the lake and let the space explain itself. People didn't say much when they saw it. The same thing happened each time: the silence, the attempt to see the far shore, the comprehension that there was no far shore visible, and then the slow revision of the scale of what they were standing next to. One man laughed, but it wasn't a funny laugh. It was the laugh of a person whose nervous system needed somewhere to put a large feeling, and laughing was what it chose. A woman Maren didn't know started crying and then seemed annoyed at herself for it. An old rancher crouched at the water's edge the way Maren had, put his hand in, looked at his own wet hand for a moment, and said nothing at all. Every single person who came to the lake's edge, Maren offered water. Every single person drank. On the second trip of the first afternoon, the group included the woman with the 2 buckets from the morning, and her 12-year-old son who had apparently refused to stay behind. When they reached the water, the son immediately wanted to understand the geology of it, where the water came from, how long it had been there, why it was cold. He asked Maren questions she didn't know how to answer, and she told him honestly that she didn't know, and that there was a man named Arthur Crail in Carson City who could explain it better. And the boy said with the total seriousness of 12-year-olds addressing their own futures, "I'm going to study rocks." His mother looked at him, and then at Maren, and her expression was the kind that doesn't have a clean name, something between gratitude and grief and relief and recognition all at once. The look of a woman who has been managing scarcity so long that abundance, when it appears, looks at first like something you might not deserve. "He'll need a school for that," the woman said quietly. "Then Cinderwash needs a school," Maren said. The woman looked at her. Then she looked at the lake. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it does." Sutter unlocked the well Tuesday morning. He didn't announce it. He didn't make a statement or attach conditions or send his foreman ahead to explain the terms. He simply unlocked the pump and left the gate open. And People discovered it the way they discover most significant things, through someone else noticing and telling 2 people who told 4 people who told the rest. By noon, the public trough was full for the first time in a week, and children were running their hands through it with the specific ecstasy of children who have been told not to waste something, and have suddenly been told they don't have to be careful anymore. Maren heard about the well from Jonas Pete, who told her with the particular expression of a man who had been in commerce long enough to understand that some moves were strategic and was still choosing to take the move at face value. He opened it, he said. I know, she said. What does that mean? She thought about what she'd said to Sutter in that office. A chance to be on the right side of the history of this place. She didn't know if he had taken it as an offer or as a warning, and she wasn't sure it mattered. Either way, the water was running. It means water's running, she said. For now, that's enough. The legal challenge came 3 weeks later, as she had expected it would. Sutter's lawyers, real ones, from Carson City, the kind with the right suits and the right confidence, filed a contest against the mineral rights interpretation of the deed, arguing that water rights and mineral rights were separate categories under territorial law and that the 1,869 deeds protections did not extend to subsurface water resources. It was not a frivolous argument. The land office clerk had been right that nothing was ironclad, and the lawyers had found the seam in the protection and were pushing on it with appropriate professional force. But Maren had also been right about what mattered. By the time the lawyers filed, Arthur Crail's full assessment was on public record with the Territorial Geological Commission. Preliminary had been filed Monday as promised, and the complete 40-page report with diagrams and measurements and the technical language of official science had followed 2 weeks later. Horace Pruitt's original 1,871 assessment was attached as supporting documentation. The community covenant was notarized and filed with the land office. 60-odd Cinderwash residents had seen the aquifer with their own eyes and drunk the water with their own mouths, and that number grew every week as Maren continued bringing groups up the mountain. You couldn't unknow a lake. You couldn't file a legal brief against 60 witnesses. The case went to the territorial court in Carson City that winter. Maren went herself, alone on the stage, without a lawyer of her own because she could not afford one, which the judge, a man named Aldous Price, who wore reading glasses perched at the very end of a nose that looked like it had been placed there as an afterthought, acknowledged in his opening summary of the case with a dryness that suggested he'd seen this particular asymmetry before and had feelings about it. She was allowed to present her own evidence. She put the original deed on the table. She put Pruitt's assessment, her father's letter, Crail's full report. She described what she had found and when and how. She described the community covenant and the terms under which access had been granted. Sutter's lawyers were good. They had arguments she could not always counter in real time, terminology she had to ask the judge to clarify, procedural points that went over her head and landed in territory she couldn't follow. She sat there and felt the inadequacy of trying to defend something real against people who were professionally expert at making real things sound complicated. At one point, one of the lawyers made a reference to the claim being purchased at a fair price before any aquifer was documented, implying that Sutter's original $20 offer had been a legitimate transaction rather than what it was. The judge looked over his glasses. The claim was not sold, he said. There was an offer, not sold price, said with the finality of a man closing a door. Next point. After 2 days of testimony and argument, Judge Price recessed and returned the following morning with a ruling that was 13 pages long and that Maren read 3 times on the stage home to make sure she understood it. She understood it. The Mineral Rights Clause, as interpreted by the original 1,869 territorial charter under which the claim was filed, covered all subsurface resources, including water, on the basis that the charter predated the categorical separation formalized in the 18,874 Water Ordinance. The aquifer belonged to Blackfinch Claim. The community covenant filed prior to any legal challenge had transferred community access rights in a legally binding manner. Those rights were permanent and non-revocable by any subsequent owner of the claim. Sutter's challenge was denied. She didn't feel triumphant reading it. She felt tired, mostly. The specific tired of a thing being finished that has cost you for a long time. Its windows were dark. She folded the ruling back into its envelope and put it in the inside pocket of her coat and looked out the stage window at the desert going past and let herself be tired without making anything out of it. She was going home. The work of connecting the aquifer to the valley took most of the following year. It was not elegant work. The pipeline that was eventually built from the mountain was a community effort in the most literal sense, people giving what they had, time and labor and material, in the irregular way that communities give things when the giving comes from need rather than obligation. There were weeks when progress stalled because money ran out, or materials hadn't arrived, or the engineering proved harder than the plan had suggested. There were arguments about the route and the construction method and who was responsible for what section of the work. Jonas Pete organized the supply side with the methodical effectiveness of a man who had been running a feed store for 15 years and knew how to account for things. Del Calloway, who turned out to have more construction experience than his weathered appearance suggested, took charge of the physical installation with a patience and precision that surprised everyone who had only seen him on the road to Elko with everything he owned in a wagon. Ruth Calloway started the school. Not formally. Not immediately, but she had been a teacher before she married Del, and she had come to this valley and watched the absence of it, and she started with 6 children at the table in the boarding house and worked outward from there in the practical, undramatic way that people build things when they are serious about building them, rather than about the idea of building. The boy Maren had learned his name was Thomas came to the school and announced on the first day that he intended to learn everything about rocks and water and the earth. And Ruth assigned him additional reading from the 2 science texts she had, which was all she had, and wrote a letter to Carson City for more. Nessa Grisraywillow came to the mountain twice more that year, and both times she and Marens sat outside the mine entrance and watched the valley and said things and didn't say things in the proportion that had become their way. On the second visit, in the fall, when the light on the valley went amber and long, Nessa said, "Your father would have argued with how long this took." "He'd have been right," Maren said. "No," Nessa said. "He just would have argued. He argued with everything." She was quiet for a moment, going well. Coming from Nessa, that was a substantial statement. Sutter did not disappear. He was not destroyed, not ruined, not run out of the valley on any kind of rail, literal or otherwise. He was a man who had built something real in 12 years, regardless of the methods, and he still had his land and his ranch and his operation, none of which depended on the water monopoly now that the monopoly was gone. He was quieter in town than he had been. His particular way of occupying space, that assumption of centrality, the pleasant patience of a man who knew the leverage was always there even when he wasn't using it, that had changed, because the lever was gone, and the knowledge of its absence changed how a person moved in a room. He and Maren encountered each other twice that year, once at the land office and once at the feed store. Both times he acknowledged her with the same nod, and she acknowledged him back, and nothing further was exchanged. She thought about what Nessa had said, not a cruel man, a practical one, and she found she believed it, which did not mean she forgave what he had done and did not mean she forgot it. It just meant she was 20 years old, and already tired enough to understand that some people were problems rather than villains, and problems, unlike villains, didn't have endings that satisfied in clean ways. She had kept the camp on the mountain through the summer, coming and going between the claim and the town, and when the pipeline work was in its final phase and the cavern didn't need her daily attention anymore, she faced the question of what she was going to do next. She had not thought far past this. She had operated in the immediate for so long, the next wall to break through, the next person to convince, the next stage to catch that the future, which had always been abstract, was suddenly concrete and standing in front of her waiting for instructions. She could leave. She had no practical obligation to stay in Cinderwash. The covenant was filed, the claim was protected, the pipeline would be finished before winter, and the town had what she had come to give it. She had accomplished the thing her father had asked. And then the things that emerged from doing that thing, and she was free in the specific sense of someone who has completed a commitment. She was also, without quite deciding to be, from here. Most of its windows were dark. That was the thing about places that ask something real from you. They get into your bones in a way that chosen places don't. And Cinderwash had asked everything from her, had taken 3 weeks of her labor and the blisters on her hands and the weight of 3 weeks on a mountain in the cold. And she had given all of it, and the giving had done what giving does when it's real. It had made the thing given to feel like hers. She stayed. She settled the claim formally that winter, taking up residence in a small house on the north end of town that had been empty for a year, a rough, impractical house, with a fireplace that smoked when the wind came from the northwest, and a floor that was uneven in a way she suspected would never entirely be resolved. She bought it with money she didn't have and owed for 2 years on, and she moved into it with almost nothing, same as she'd arrived with almost nothing, and that parallel pleased her in a way she didn't examine too closely. The pipeline was completed on a Tuesday in early November. It was not a ceremony. It was a completion. A valve opened, water moving through a new channel for the first time, finding its way down from the mountain through the pipe that Dell and Jonas and 24 other people had built over 9 months. And the first house on the main street that was connected to the new line got water in its kitchen, and the woman who lived there stood at her kitchen spigot and turned it on and held a cup under it and filled the cup and stood there with the full cup in her hand and didn't say anything. Maren was there for that moment. She stood at the edge of the kitchen and watched. That was enough. The first full winter that the aquifer fed the valley was the harshest winter anyone in Censored or Wash could remember, not drought. The opposite. A freeze that came early and hard and stayed, froze in places they hadn't been properly insulated. There were problems with that had to be fixed in conditions that made fixing things difficult, and there were weeks of adjustment and complaint, and the practical difficulties of infrastructure that had been built quickly by people learning as they went. It was not the end of difficulty. It was not the beginning of perfection. It was a valley that had been dying, now living in the imperfect and complicated way that living things live with problems and arguments, and the ongoing need for maintenance and the occasional failure of something that had been expected to hold. But the water came. It came in the winter when everything else froze. Most of its windows were dark. It came in the spring when the gardens went in for the first time in 3 years with enough water to actually grow what was planted. It came in the summer when the river bend went shallow again, and the memory of Sutter's locked pump was fresh enough that people understood when they opened their spigots what it meant that the spigot opened. One afternoon in late spring, Maren was at the mine entrance, routine maintenance on the passage, checking the supports, making sure the cavern floor hadn't shifted in the winter freeze when she heard someone on the trail below. It was Thomas Calloway. He was 9 now, and he came up the mountain with the sure-footed confidence of a boy who had made this climb enough times that it had become a known thing rather than an adventure. He had a notebook under his arm and the expression of someone with a specific purpose. Mrs. Marsh says the aquifer recharges through limestone filtration. He said, arriving at the camp with the directness of someone who didn't see the point in small talk when there was information to be addressed. Is that what Mr. Crail told you? More or less, Maren said. He used more technical terms. Can I go in and look at the limestone? She looked at him. He looked back at her with the clear-eyed patience of a child who had learned that the adults he wanted things from were more likely to give them if he waited without fidgeting. Put this on, she said, and handed him the extra coat she kept at the camp. She took him in. Through the tunnel, through the passage, he was small enough that he went through easily, which she noted without comment, and down to the cavern floor and along the shelf to the water's edge. She held the lantern and let him look. He looked for a long time. Then he took his notebook out of his coat pocket and began writing, which she hadn't expected of a 9-year-old, and which told her several things about Ruth Calloway's school that were encouraging. My dad says your father found this, Thomas said, writing without looking up. He did. How did he know to look here? She thought about how to answer that. About the difference between what she knew, which was that her father had spent 11 years listening to a mountain in the particular way of a man who had stopped looking for one thing and started paying attention to what was actually there, and what she could say to a 9-year-old in a way that would mean something useful. He paid attention to things other people dismissed, she said. Thomas wrote that down, actually wrote it down in the notebook. She looked at him writing and felt something move through her that wasn't quite any of the emotions she had names for, not pride, because he wasn't hers, not happiness, which was too simple, not the thing people called peace, which she'd always found a suspicious word for a condition that required constant effort to maintain. Something more like rightness. The feeling of a thing being where it was supposed to be. She took him back out as the afternoon started to tip toward evening, and on the way up through the passage, she heard him catch his breath when he saw the last of the daylight, appearing at the tunnel's end, that specific quality of light that comes when you've been in the dark, long enough that ordinary afternoon looks extraordinary. She had felt that every time. She thought she always would. They came out into the open, and the valley spread below them, green in the low places where the spring planting was coming in, the rooftops of cinder wash catching the late light, the sound of water faint but present, actual water moving through pipes down there, finding its way into houses and troughs, and the school's new cistern, and the gardens, and the lives of 300, and some people who were, most of them, still there. Thomas stood at the edge of the camp and looked at it all, with the serious attention he gave to everything. "You're going to stay here," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "My mom says you're the reason we didn't go to Elko," he said. "Your mom's being generous." He considered this. "She's usually pretty accurate," he said, and went back down the mountain to go home, leaving her alone at the edge of the claim with the valley below, and the tunnel behind her, and the evening coming on in its slow, committed way. She sat down in the dirt outside the mine entrance, the same dirt she had sat in on the first afternoon. The day Nessa had appeared on the ridge trail and given her 5 words and changed the direction of everything. She was not the same person who had sat here then. She was also, in all the ways that mattered, exactly the same person. Same body, same heaviness, same worn coat that had been her father's and was now simply hers. Same hands that had never been elegant and were now additionally scarred. The world had not remade her into something easier to carry. She had just carried it further. She thought about what her father had written. Figure out how to give this water to the town in a way that nobody can ever take it back. She had figured it out. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without help. She hadn't known she needed until she needed it. Not without being afraid every step of the 3rd mile of every climb. Not without looking foolish, being underestimated, crying in a tunnel over a locket, running out of money and plans at the same time, standing in a courtroom without a lawyer, and hoping the truth was enough. It had been enough. Not because the world was just, not because good things happened to people who deserved them. She had lived long enough and watched carefully enough to know that neither of those things was reliably true. It had been enough because she had not stopped. Because her father had not stopped. Because Nessa had kept faith for 3 years with a secret that could have bought her nothing and cost her the respect of a town that watched for weakness. Because Del Calloway had carried his sick boy up a mountain trail and said, "We're not going to Elko without being asked." Because Arthur Crail had gone back to his office and filed the paperwork in the right order at the right time. Because 60 people had stood at the edge of an underground lake and understood, without being told, what they were looking at and what it meant. It had taken all of them. That was the thing she hadn't understood when she arrived. Here she had arrived, expecting to solve it. It sounds the way her father had solved it alone, because that was the model she had inherited. One person, a mountain, a decision carried in secret. But the carrying alone part had almost defeated him, and it would have defeated her. And the thing she had done differently, not better, just differently, because she hadn't had any choice, was that she had let people in. Not gracefully, not strategically. She had let a sick child drink the water, and it had started from there. And the rest had grown from that beginning, the way things grow when they start from something real. She took the locket from around her neck. She held it in her palm, the small oval weight of it, and looked at it for a long time. Then she opened it and looked at the photograph inside the formal portrait, her mother looking directly at the camera with the composed expression that Maren now knew from the second photograph was just the face her mother made when she was sitting still and being watched. Not her real face. The real face was the one caught in partial profile, looking at something outside the frame, almost smiling. She closed the locket. She put it back around her neck. Below her, the lights of cinder wash were beginning to appear in the early dusk, 1, then 3, then more, scattered orange rectangles in the blue settling of the evening. Enough lights for a town. Enough town for the lights to mean something. Her father had left her a hole in the ground. He had also left her a lake, a letter, a locket, a legal document, a name that needed restoring, and the exact specific kind of stubbornness that had kept him on this mountain for 11 years passed down through blood and absence, and the particular way daughters inherit from fathers. They barely knew not through being taught, but through being shaped by the shape of what was missing and becoming, in the end, the thing that the shape was missing of. She was 21 years old. She was not finished being tired. She was not finished making mistakes. She had a house with a smoking fireplace and a debt she owed for 2 more years and a community covenant that would need defending again, in some form, eventually, because things that matter always do. But tonight the valley had water, and the mountain was at her back. And that was, she decided, enough to start from.